on your report.
All right, Mr. Chair, the recording's going.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I'm welcoming you to the April 7th Marine Fish Advisory Commission meeting, April 7th, 2022. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and we will have a roll call vote. So, Jared, would you like to do that?
Yeah, just a roll call of who's in attendance. So in attendance for the commission, we have Chairman Kane, Vice Chairman Peardenach, Bill Doyle, Khalil Bogdan, Lou Williams, Suki Sawyer, Shelley Edmondson. I think that's the 7. Absent today are Bill Amaru and Tim Brady, although they may be joining later.
Yes, and Khalil has asked, he texted me and asked that I call on him last on any vote. So,
Okay.
just to keep everybody informed due to his illness. So we're going to do a review of the agenda. Any changes to the agenda?
Dan?
Dan?
I don't have any changes to the agenda.
Okay, so Jared called on you. I don't know why, but
Well, just to make sure you had no changes, but with no changes, we can proceed to number 2.
thank you very much, Jared. Review and approval of the March 10th, 2022 draft business meeting minutes.
Motion to accept. Suki.
Thank you, Susie.
I have a couple of changes, actually.
Shelley, you're recognized.
Thank you. On page, at the bottom of page 2, it says that I asked about the status, or Ray asked about the status of my Wilk study. I'd just like to change at the top of the next page, instead of size ratios, it should be measurements such as shell measurements. And then right after that, at the end of the next paragraph, I also asked if there was a way to model whelk sex ratios at the various minimum size requirements, and that wasn't recorded in the minutes.
I'll add those, Shelley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. So we'll need a roll call vote if
Well,
there's
we
no
need
other changes.
Accept as amended.
What was that, Jared?
We need a motion to accept as amended.
Okay.
Motion.
Suki, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah. Motion to amend.
Thank you, Suki. I need a second.
Shelley will second it.
Is anybody opposed?
Oh, we need a
We have to do a roll call, right? Roll call vote. Okay, Suki,
Yeah.
thank you. Bill Doyle,
Yes.
is Lou Williams on?
Yes.
Thank you. Shelley,
Yes.
Tim Brady isn't on yet. Bill Amaru isn't on yet. Mike Peardenach
Yes.
and Khalil.
Yes.
Thank you all. Moving on to comments. Once again, I appreciate the participation of the membership on the Marine Fish Advisory Commission, and I will turn it over to Commissioner Ron Amidon. Ron, are you on?
I'm not saying we're on this morning.
Okay, then we can move it along to law enforcement. I presume it's going to be Lieutenant Bass.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, all. I don't have much to report. It's much more than our deer cleanup efforts in the bay are kind of winding down. I think the bay is all but clear of gear. I think the contract boats are all but done. We've since moved the Jesse up to Boston to pick off any complaint or problem gear up there. And now kind of probably transitioning into the the speed enforcement aspect of the whales, which I think are currently sitting off the east end of the Cape Cod Canal right now. That I think we have our elvers and herring are in. We haven't seen much elver activity. I think the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine has reached their quota, and the price is only at about $1,900 a pound, but still some time left, I think. But we've yet to see any activity down here. And with that, I think we're just waiting for the hammer to fall with striped bass, sea bass, scup, everything else to hopefully show up soon and kick off the season. That's all I have. If I missed anything or have any questions.
Questions for Lieutenant Bass?
Mike Pearnock,
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Lieutenant Bass. Just a question. How far north have they observed the herring? And with the haddock fishery opening, I heard it was pretty slow here in the South Shore. It was more of a Jeffries type of fishery. Just curious of what you saw at the docks in Massachusetts. Thanks.
In regards to herring or haddock?
Both. How far
Uh,
north are the herring showing up? Just curious.
That's a good question. My world's a little kind of, I don't know, small, being more south. I don't know how far north they have. Maybe somebody from DMF has a better idea. And a couple of the haddock boats, they didn't seem to be catching too much, just, Mass Bay and whatnot. So you might be right, being a little further north of Jeffries.
No, thank you. That's consistent with what I'm hearing. We can talk about herring later, unless there's a quick answer to that. Thank you.
Lieutenant Bass, it's Ray Kane. I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Pertaining to ghost gear. So this DMF has contracted 5 or 6 boats to retrieve ghost gear. And my thought, I know I was speaking to one vessel, and I believe they are out there in March, still retrieving. Is there any way to initiate that program sooner, like in January, to get the boats out there? Because I may be mistaken, but how many people are on the vessels? Somebody from DMF staff and enforcement, or can you give us a rundown on that?
Well,
Yeah.
go ahead, Dan. I was going to say.
Yeah, hey, Ray, I think Bob Glenn's going to cover this in his presentation on this protected species update.
Okay.
Bob, is
Okay.
that accurate?
Yeah, good morning. No, I didn't have that in there, but I'm happy to address the question now if you'd like, Dan.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, so Ray, thanks for asking the question. Certainly we started this probably the first full week in February hauling gear out, and we finished up around May 15th. Given this is the first year with this program, we were hauling a lot more gear than anticipated, but I think between our efforts and MEP's excellent efforts to enforce, write tickets, and bring cases, I expect the situation to get better. One of the issues with not being able to start prior to February is that the season doesn't close until February 1st. And so it's difficult for us to use aerial surveillance at that time of year to identify ghost gear. Because once February 1st comes, every gear in the water is potential ghost gear, and it all has to be hauled. But prior to that, there's legally fished active gear, and you just can't differentiate it from the air. And it's too much coast to try to cover via boat to differentiate what is ghost versus what is actively fished. So that's primarily the reason for the starting in February when the season closes. But I anticipate that, and I think Lieutenant Bass can attest to this, is that after a few years of enforcement, things get better. And certainly I believe that's what we've seen in Cape Cod Bay, who's had the closure a bit longer.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, and absolutely agree with that. The learning curve is probably still going on up north, but we did start toward December and January, especially because we have the closed recreational season, so we could pick off some of that recreational gear. And then also we know some of the boats that have been hauled out, and if you see some of their gear still in the water, it's lost, or they don't. We can either have somebody get it for them or get it ourselves. So we kind of get an early start. But yeah, I agree with Bob that if it's potentially legal before February, there's not much we can do about it.
Thank you, Lieutenant Bass. Any other questions for Lieutenant Bass? No hands raised, Jared.
no more questions for Lieutenant Bass.
Director McKiernan, you're up.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. First thing I want to announce is the meeting, and I think many of you have already responded to the meeting request for July 12th. That would be our summer meeting. And we intend to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission. We'd also like to bring back or invite back some of the former commission members and former directors who get involved in this illustrious activity of managing Massachusetts state waters fisheries. So I look forward to that and your attendance. And we're going to hold it down here in our New Bedford office because we have a great conference room on the first floor that would accommodate such a crowd. But we do intend to try to have some kind of a outdoor cookout or gathering so that folks can reconnect with some of the folks you haven't seen in a while. So really looking forward to that.
So I have a question, Dan.
Yeah, go ahead.
We usually don't have a commission meeting in July. That's usually the 1 month we don't. So is this a meeting or is this a party?
Well, that's a good question, Ray, because it all depends on some of the emergency actions that we might need to approve. And I'll work with Jared to see if there's any essential business that we need to conduct. I'm going to suggest or forecast that it might be mostly a social event, but I think we'll probably have some essential business that we might have to conduct because of the emergency actions that we're going to be taking action on. Jared, do you want to weigh in on whether you would need final approval of some of those rules in July?
So there's the emergency actions for the various recreational fishing regulations that, depending on, I'd anticipate those will be done at the June meeting rather than the July meeting, but there is a emerging coastal sharks issue that we might have to deal with at the July meeting. I wouldn't anticipate more than an hour business meeting. So I would agree with Dan's take that this is largely a social event and we'll deal with whatever nominal business beforehand. So it will be about an hour business meeting, perhaps.
Thanks, Jared.
Thank you, Jared.
Okay, next on my list of things I'd like to report on is DMF attended the seafood show with a promotion put on by Mass Department of Agriculture with some funding. It was called the Mass Ave, and it featured about 10 Massachusetts seafood businesses. And I think it was considered a success. And many of those same businesses also were enlisted to go to the New England Food Show as well. And that was held just this week at the convention center as well. So our seafood marketing program is really doing a great job with getting exposure for some of the Massachusetts businesses. So I want to thank them for all their work. I have spent considerable time on the issues of right whale conservation over the last month. Congress has allocated $16 million for states to provide support for industry to comply with the recently enacted whale rules, also to conduct some research as needed, and finally to fund trackers, which was something we're going to talk about under the ASMFC update. Our share of that has yet to be determined. It's probably going to be in the range of 20 or 25%. That's the first thing I'd like to report. The second was, and you received a link from us last week, the report by Noah Oppenheim, who was a contractor to DMF. And the report is called Assessing the Feasibility of On-Demand Gear in New England Lobster Fisheries. I will confess that it's a fairly dense report. It's quite substantive, but it's a really important issue for our time. And the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation reached out to us asking us to do kind of an objective study on what prevents ropeless fishing from being like adopted today. And so Noah, as the author, he did a wonderful job on this. He conducted about 60 in-depth phone interviews with various stakeholder groups. He also held a 2-day workshop back in October, and he finally released this report. And a lot of people are quite happy with the report, including the funders. And it's going to be quite useful. So with that as a backdrop, on Monday, late on Monday, I sent a letter to the Pioneers for Peaceful Coexistence, and this letter was a denial for the request for a letter of authorization. And we're going to talk about that later in this meeting. But the reaction was predictable, and depending on which side of the issue you're on. And it's something I have to navigate, or the agency has to navigate, and try to be, as honest and as forthright as possible, and also looking forward as to what these real challenges are. We as fishery managers, we see things that really a lot of other folks don't see in terms of the unintended consequences and the complexities of this issue. So I'm looking forward to discussing this with you as a commission. And then finally, I'd like to thank the staff for all the hard work they've put in the last month to set up the hearings, not only of the virtual hearings that we have, but we had an in-person public meeting, so to speak, with many of the inshore dragomen. That was really one of the better meetings we've had in a long time to talk about the fluke issues. And of course, and I'm sure you've had a chance to read these memos that we as an agency put to you. I and the staff do put a lot of effort into that. And while they're long, they're very, very detailed and really nicely polished products. So I want to thank my staff for helping me with that. So that's all I got. I'll take any questions, but most of what I talked about, we will be discussing later. But if there's anything I didn't touch on that commission members would like to ask me about, I'm here to answer any of that.
Questions for the director?
Suki?
Yep, thanks, Ray. Thanks, Jared. Dan, I have two little questions. One is, hear anything about the status of the lobster? I can't even think of it now. Not the biological opinion, but the lobster, the fisheries designations.
Oh, yes, the list of fisheries.
Yeah, list of fisheries. That's it. Thank you.
Yes. So for the rest of the commission, the federal government, under the authority of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, publishes what's called a list of fisheries, and they list these fisheries that either are expected to interact with marine mammals or are on a regular basis or an occasional basis, and they categorize them accordingly as category 1, 2, and 3. And historically, the lobster fishery in the Northeast United States has been issued or characterized as category 1, which is a fishery that is expected to take marine mammals. And that's the one that we're struggling with, because as we have enacted all of these new rules, we have requested a lower category, such as lower in the rank, so category 2, even category 3. And last August, National Marine Fisheries Service did propose that we would be listed in the final rule as a category 2, which certainly paved the way for us in our incidental take permit application. As of this date, there's no final rule, and we are anxiously awaiting the final rule from National Marine Fisheries Service. But I honestly expected it to be out in March, especially based on some communications I've had with folks inside of the National Marine Fisheries Service. But I regret to tell you that it's been crickets, and we'll continue to look into it.
Okay, thanks for that, Dan. And one other thing was, have you heard anything about the status of this Maine's request of, to extend out the rules for May 1st? And if they do that, is that going to be for all Area 1 fishermen, mass guys that fish in federal waters? Are they going to get the extension too, or they're not going to be part of it, or whatever?
I have not I don't have any update on Maine's request. I think they were concerned about the lack of supplies. Bob Glenn, could you help me with any update on that front?
Yeah, Dan, I can report that I don't have an update on that front. I'm aware that Maine did make a request to National Marine Fisheries Service, but I have not heard any further communications from National Marine Fisheries Service about delaying the implementation of those. So as far as I understand it, given that we're closing in at this point, we're still on track for the May 1st implementation date. But I haven't, National Marine Fisheries hasn't neither accepted or denied that the Maine's request, as far as I know.
Suki, I will say that on an unrelated issue, the trap tag orders appear to be very much delayed.
Yeah.
And we may be extending that deadline to June 1st, even though we just enacted a rule of 4 months ago that said we're moving it up to May 1st. It appears many fishermen are not going to be able to get their trap tags in time, even though they ordered them back in February. And we had kind of heard that the trap tag vendor was having some worker shortages, not so much supply chain, but worker shortages. And so that's something we're going to have to figure out in the next few days.
Oh, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I completely forgot about that, Dan. Yeah, the trap tag thing was an issue. I forgot that was implemented for May 1st. So probably an extension would be a good idea.
Yeah.
Great, thanks for that.
Okay.
Thank you, Suki. Any other questions for the director?
Not seeing any other hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Moving on to action items, commercial limits for quota managed species, summer flounder limits. Dan?
Yep. Thank you, Ray. Jared is going to put up on the screen basically the proposals that we're bringing to you for new rules. I'll just, I don't want to read a 12-page memo for you folks. I think you've had a chance to look at it, and the work product is quite comprehensive. I do want to say that, as just overall background, we are facing really deficiencies in our landings relative to the quotas, and in the last few years, and with the recent increase in quota for this year, it's forecasted to be much worse. So, some kind of liberalizations are in order. And so what we've done is we've proposed a whole suite of minor tweaks to enhance the utilization of the quota. And so this is really a story of kind of two fleets. We have this 30/70 allocation that has been historic going back to over 20 years. There's an offshore fleet that works primarily out of New Bedford that is pretty good at catching fish, and they have the the infrastructure, they have the vessels, and they usually take their allocation, their seasonal allocation. Our inshore fleet is a little more challenged based on declining participation. Also, challenges on the fishing grounds, such as increased filamentous algae in the water column, which clogs the nets. Increased fees for some of the draggers to tie up. That's discouraged them from participating. Other fishing opportunities that have presented themselves. So some of the fleet has headed off to other fisheries, other ports, and other species. And so, we met with the inshore fleet at a separate meeting requested by the Mass Fishermen's Partnership President Eddie Barrett, and the turnout was really great. And so it didn't surprise me that when we held the public hearing, the Zoom hearing, we got actually no comments, because I think most of the participants felt that the inshore fishery participants felt they had already given us their input. So we have a proposal here that changes many aspects of the rules in small ways. It maintains many of the features you've seen for a long time, but it also tries to take advantage of the historical trends and uses our knowledge and kind of, wisdom about what has to be done based on what time of year it is. And so what we're trying to avoid is to come back to you in like August and ask you for a liberalization under that 2-week comment period. Instead, we think that we know enough about the fisheries so that we can look at the landings to date. And if there's certain amounts of poundage left, we can have an automatic increase. And so I really like the way that we've incorporated a lot of the input from the fleet and create a rule that I think makes a lot of sense. So, one of the biggest things was the 30-70 split. What we've done there is instead of going up to say 50-50 split, the seasonal allocations, we're going to maintain the 30-70, but we're going to allow the winter fishery to take the full 30 before we drop that 100-pound trip limit, or drop the trip limit to 100 pounds, that is. We're increasing the wintertime trip limit from 1,000 to 3,000 pounds, which is consistent with what some of the other states are doing. And we want to codify that pilot program, which allows the vessels that have multiple states landing permits to go from state to state to state, at the end of a trip, unloading fish in different states. As far as the summer period, we're talking about allowing the squid fishery and the fluke fishery to kind of co-occur, to give fishermen an option. If there's squid around, they'll put the small mesh on. If there's not, they can put the large mesh on. It'll give them more flexibility. And also increases in the daily trip limit. And then, of course, as we get toward the end of the season, we're talking about increasing the trip limit based on amount of fish that's left in the quota and the balance. And then finally, for the October period, we're talking about another automatic increase, provided we have at least 5% of the quota left. In other words, this is some of that intel that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, that we understand the trends in landings, and we think that we have a good handle on what kind of needs to be done without having to come back to you folks with this in-season adjustments. I'm really pleased with the way this has come together, and the fact that we're using our experience to write a rule that meets that fits the nuances of this fishery in all of its phases: inshore, offshore, little boat, big boat. And I'm really happy with this proposal. So again, what's on the board? We're going from 1,000 to 3,000 during the winter fishery. That's 7 days a week. In the period 2, we're going from 400 to 500, and for the draggers, and up to 300 for the hook boats. Again, we're opening squid on April 23rd, but giving that dragger fleet that same opportunity to also fish for fluke if they want to put on the big mesh, and gives them flexibility. And a lot of the fleet talked about, if they're going to survive, they need to be flexible. They need to be able to make business decisions and not be boxed in by the regulations as much as they are now. And then, of course, the increases in the fall based on quota remaining. So, are there any questions about this proposal?
Let's add the 2 things on here.
Sure, go ahead, Jared.
With the increase, with the adjustment of the no fishing days in the summertime period, too, going from Sunday, Thursday to 7 days a week, we'll be making similar changes to the black sea bass and horseshoe crab regs, which currently have the Friday, Saturday off days, and we'll be allowing 7 days a week for landing of those 2 species in the trawl fishery, given that there's a bycatch of those species in this fishery, so as to avoid discarding on Fridays and Saturdays. And then the other thing is moving that fall fishery to October provides the offshore fleet with an additional opportunity to fish at higher levels before the larger fisheries to our south open. particularly Virginia and North Carolina. And when they open on November 1, historically the prices dropped and it's become not particularly viable to fish fluke offshore during that November, December period. And we see that in our landings because they drop off pretty dramatically, even at higher limits. So by going to October 1, there'll be that 1 month period where the offshore fleet maybe you would take advantage of that higher trip limit. And that's consistent with the comments we got from the inshore fishery about maintaining the existing allocations, but torquing the regulations to allow the offshore fleet to better access the quota available to them in the winter and the fall.
And Jared, you also mentioned the multi-state possession limit that in the past has been just a spring or winter, early spring feature.
We're making that in the fall as well, correct?
Right, yeah. So I think that this effectively addresses the concerns of the inshore fleet. You know, I think we've given the inshore fleet the kind of flexibility that they're looking for. It also allows the inshore fleet to still be assured of having most of the catch if they can take it. But I think the thinking like among us in the office is that the stock has kind of shifted more to the offshore waters, even in the late summer. And when we had such a small possession limit, it really didn't make economic sense for those guys to travel too far. So a lot of guys just left the fishery. And so by having the higher trip limits, we think that we can have more participation by many of the vessels that won't be so constrained by the low trip limits that were really designed back in the low quota days of keeping those little boats viable. I mean, when we were as low as 300 pounds, some of those trips were only 3 or 4 hours long. Now I think many of the inshore fleet see this as an opportunity to be more viable and to especially with fuel costs. I know that's going to be a big issue. You don't want to be spending a whole lot of fuel for only 300 pounds of fish, but having this opportunity of higher trip limits, but also Jared mentioned the pilot program where we were running, where we allowed the boats to have a second day's catch on the boat from the previous day, as long as they sealed it up. We're going to continue to do that. So I think we've responded favorably to a lot of the concerns that were presented to us. I'll stop there.
Bill Amaru?
Bill,
Thank
you're
you, Chair.
recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, Mr. Chairman. I'm here with my recovering state. I'm a little bit dizzy, maybe because of the amount of pain medication that I have to be on. Hopefully that won't interfere too much. I wanted to commend you, Dan, in the division for the work you've done on this, and the importance really that stands out as an example to the entire management of fisheries, both federal and in state. The fact that you organize meetings which can easily be attended, numerous meetings, and listen to the fishermen. And it's produced a plan which is going to be very helpful to the industry and will not be a threat to the fish. I'm very happy with this. If this had been the fishery regulations when I was trawling and fishing for fluke, we would have done twice what we were doing at that time. Okay, so that's my statement there. The only thing I've heard from fishermen is the timeliness of the late season adjustments. And I think you might have heard this from Phil and from Dom as well, or other fishermen, Dan, that they want to be able to be notified that these changes are going to be coming as early as possible and that they be made as early as possible. I know you have set percentage limits for when they're going to happen, but that's an important factor, the timing. And the last thing I would comment on is I'm not concerned about the 7-day a week. I talked to enough fishermen who told me that with the needs of maintenance on the boat And despite it's the middle of the summer, there are plenty of days when the wind comes cranking out of the southwest at 20 to 30 knots, makes it pretty difficult for those smaller boats to be fishing anyway. So I think if you see a 5 to 10% increase in actual days fished, that would be in line with what I think you might expect. I don't expect it to be a huge increase. Okay, so, and for anyone who doesn't know, I had my hip replaced yesterday, and it was a successful operation, and I'm hoping to be back on my feet soon and be back out on the water in the summer. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, Bill.
Hey, Ray, could I ask Story Reed to kind of weigh in on terms of quota monitoring and, you know, how
By all
we'll,
means,
how
Story.
we'll notify the fleet of when we get close to those triggers?
Story, you're recognized.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Dan. And that was a good question by Bill. So I think by that time in the summer, late summer, as we approach that September 1st trigger, the landings are tracking pretty well. We'll have a really good handle on how they're tracking that far into the season. So we'll be able to make that call probably several days in advance if we're going to have that amount of quota remaining. So I think we can give the fleet pretty good notice there.
Yes, Story, can you comment on the sort of the forecastability of fluke landings from week to week to week, as opposed to other species?
Sure. Fluke landings tend to be pretty, the landings rate seem to be pretty uniform throughout the summer. We'll see dips, but I think we can forecast pretty well on that, especially with a quota of 1.4 million pounds like we have this year.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm teasing out of you is I bet we can give the fleet more than a few days notice. I mean,
Well,
if we're
several
really
days,
short, yeah.
Probably a couple weeks. And as we know, most of the fleet watches our quota monitoring page as closely as we do, and will be helping us with that call. So yeah, we'll be able to give them a week or two notice.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Story. Questions for the director?
Mike Pearnock,
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dan, for your presentation. I support the fact that the commercial fleet needs to land its quota. And this is a mechanism to do such with increased bag limits and a 7-day-a-week fishing effort and catch. As has been discussed in the past, our summer flounder are migrating further offshore with increased temperature or into deeper waters. That impacts the ability for the commercial as well as the recreational fleet to catch those fish in state waters. I'm not sure if this is the answer to try to address such before that does occur. And none of us have a crystal ball of whether that'll occur again this year, but consistent with historical trends, I would expect to see the same. My one another comment is that, as you know, we've had this discussion historically in the past, and since this is a commercial state fishery, more fish will be removed within the commercial state waters. Ultimately, then that will impact recreational fishermen's ability to catch those fish. I am not sure what the answer is, other than it is a concern. And we've seen the decreases in landings that I think is more a result of the climatic shift and the shift of the stock into deeper waters, and want to have a mechanism where both the commercial and recreational community can live together with a balancing act to make this work. I'm just concerned with the 7 days a week, whether that's going to be possible, but we will have to see. But there's a bigger problem to this, as I think you all know, that the Mid-Atlantic commercial fleet comes into federal waters, catches the fish and takes off, and to the detriment of our state commercial or recreational fishermen. And that's something that continues to occur that ultimately impacts how much summer flounder we'll find in state waters. So I do support this, but I have my concerns consistent with the past, and would just like to get your thoughts, Dan. Thank you.
Well,
Dan?
yes, thanks, Ray. So my personal take on it is we're looking at an inshore fleet, especially the dragger fleet, and even the hook fleet for that matter, that it's an all-time low in terms of participation. The number of trips continues to go down, and the safety issue, I think, is a really good one. That if we can allow the fleet to pick their days, I don't think any rational person wants to fish 7 days a week, not on a sustained basis. And it's going to give these businesses just choices. I'm more concerned about the further attrition of this fleet, especially as it's related to being squeezed out by municipalities, and the fact that it's more and more difficult for this fleet to tie up. And that to me is one of the biggest contributors, along, of course, with the weed in the water. And I'm trying to help these guys hang on, allowing that 2-day trip allowance gives them some great opportunity, because some of them, that while they don't have slips in Hyannis, still have to pay an unloading fee, and they can stay out on the water, or lay on the doors overnight and put in a 2-day trip. So I'm trying to give this fleet the sufficient flexibility to hang on. And I would add that there's a intern from the UMass Boston Urban Harbors Institute that actually accompanied us to the meeting last month in Plymouth with the fleet. And she's doing a survey of the fleet in terms of their challenges and their participation in the fishery, and if they're participating less, why is that? So it's kind of on the theme of like the working waterfront and what is happening to our working waterfront, and in terms of what are the constraints on fishing participation, how much of the lack of participation is being caused by a regulation like the one we have, 5-day-a-week fishery, the low trip limits. How much of it is being affected by municipal decisions to give away, important docking to other commercial vessels that actually do tours as opposed to bring in seafood. So I do not expect that we're going to see a large increase in effort. As Bill Emery kind of forecasted, a 5 to 10% increase would be great, and helping some of these boats just remain viable is my objective. And the results of this women's survey, the intern, are going to be presented at a working waterfront conference scheduled for July. Story, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
I will just add, she's started that survey with an brief electronic survey to 20 or 25 of the inshore draggers, and she's had an excellent response rate. So that's really good for the ultimate results of the survey. So she'll be doing phone interviews soon, but she's had great response from the fleet. And I think it was because she was at that meeting with us where we had good participation. So looking forward to the results of that.
Yeah, and if I may, there's a figure, I believe, in the memo, but was certainly presented in the first memo back in November, and at the public hearing and the public meetings we've held on this issue. And, both effort and participation compared to 10 years ago in this fishery are down about 50%. So, if Bill Emery's comment that this might increase effort by the number of trips by 5 to 10%, based on a recent historical average, we'd still be below where we were 10 years ago in the number of trips being taken by the trawl fleet, even with the changes to the days in the season.
Thanks, Jared.
Any other questions for the director?
Mike, did you have a follow-up question? Because your hand's still raised?
I hope that with the reduction in the recreational size limit that is hopefully going to be implemented this upcoming season, that as a result of such, there will be the opportunity to catch summer flounder for the recreational community. Because if you're in Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound, historically, we have observed or seen less fish for various reasons, whether it's climatic shift. And with this, there will be more commercial activity for more removals. If you live out in the Chatham area, between Chatham and Nantucket, different story. But if you're not fortunate enough to live there in that area to fish that, or to fish that area, there's no lack of fish. So I guess with this, I'm concerned, and time will tell. And it's a matter of managing the commercial and the recreational fishery together to make it work for both. And as been pointed out in the past, the differential between the 14-inch size limit and the recreational size limit, it makes it more difficult to have those fish available for the recreational community. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Dan, I have a question.
Go ahead, Ray.
This is what, the third or fourth year that we're calling this a pilot program where we allow the trawl fleet to fish 2 consecutive days, lay on the doors one night. So how many more years are we going to call this? Is there a reason why we just keep calling it a pilot program? It's been proven effective. I don't know what enforcement has to say about it, how many violations they've written. So when do we just make this a regulation?
Well, we could do that, Ray, but we would have to go through rulemaking. So we can make that a priority for next year. Because I think if we commenced rulemaking now, we wouldn't accomplish anything until the mid-fall. So that's a good question. That's a fair point.
There's also a lot of moving parts in this program in terms of getting people tags and what those tags may be that are much easier to do through a letter of authorization than through a regulation, which is from the administrative perspective, why I continue to call it a pilot program. Where I think drafting that regulatory language might be a little complicated. It gives us more flexibility to handle it as a letter of authorization.
Right, but we could stop calling it a pilot program and put something in the language that allows us to administer this through permit conditions. So, but Ray's right, that pilot program after 4 or 5 years, it's like, okay, we call pilot programs regulations on training wheels. So, I think we're comfortable with how that's worked out. And I know the fleet's been real happy with it. I remember talking to one dragoman who loved it because he didn't have to meet the truck, at early afternoon. He actually could start his fishing day in the late afternoon, get his first day, stay on the boat, wake up next morning and get his second day's worth of fish. And it was just so much more convenient and allowed him to have so much more control over his schedule. So yeah, it's been successful. So we'll look into that, Ray. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Dan. More questions for the director?
I'm not seeing any questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jared. I'll need a motion on this.
So for these motions today, we'd ask, particularly with these more complicated ones, that the motion initially be made to accept the director's recommendation as set forth in the memorandum. And the details of that are shown on that slide. And then if the motion does not pass, I'll type out a motion with the various amendments to it so it can become more clear. But as this is a multifaceted recommendation, I think the simplest way would be for a motion to adopt the director's recommendation as set forth in the memo.
Okay, I'll call on members. We need the motion made. And
Bill
second,
Doyle, motion to approve as presented.
thank you, Bill.
Second, Suki.
Thank you, Suki. And now we do a roll call vote, Jared.
That is correct.
Thank you. Suki,
Yes.
Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Tim Brady present, or is he still not present?
Not present.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Mike Pierre not,
Yes.
Leo.
Yes.
Well, everybody's in favor. There's no opposition. Motion moves.
Thank you. Next issue is black sea bass. All right. Well, like was mentioned in by Mike Peardenach in the last discussion toward the end, there's definitely an awkwardness that is difficult to explain sometimes, because these fisheries are managed separately, the recreational and commercial fisheries. And I know we've gone through a lot of pain of trying to figure out how to meet the 20% cut in black sea bass for the recreational fishery at a time where we're increasing the commercial quotas. And that is, that's difficult to wrap your head around. But the truth is the Mid-Atlantic Council and ASMFC are bound by Magnus and Stevens, and the recreational and commercial shares of both of these stocks are established in law or in regulation through the management plans, which has the force of law. And so when one sector is exceeding their allocation, they have to take cuts. And it's unfortunate, but the black sea bass being so abundant, you know, the cuts that the recreational fishery had to take was not related to stock declines or to bad data. It was related to the fact that the percent share attributed to the recreational fishery, as established by the Mid-Atlantic Council and the ASMFC, is what it is, and the recreational sector exceeded that. So I just want everybody to know that I understand the awkwardness, especially if you're an advocate for the recreational fishery, to see some of these increases. But another reason for these increases have to do with the long-standing or the long-fought fight by DMF and other Northeast states, with Nicola playing a prominent role, to actually get more allocation, of a larger share of the commercial allocation allocated to the Northeast because of shift in the stocks, or an abundance off the Northeast states or the New England states, as opposed to the Mid-Atlantic states. So we succeeded in getting more quota taken away from some of the Mid-Atlantic states. And, you know, congratulations to us, but now we're facing this awkward moment where we're liberalizing the commercial rules while cutting back on recreational. I'm sensitive to that. But I'm trying to be as responsible as possible in terms of keeping these two sectors viable, and also to achieve this quota. So I, again, like the fluke proposal, I think staff did a good job, or a great job, looking at the historical trends, and also listening carefully to the fleet. You know, we hear from the fleet not just during these public comment periods, but we hear from them all during last year and even prior to. So we're fairly confident we're on the mark here. So our proposals in this case, just a quick overview, we're liberalizing the season by an earlier opening from July 8th to July 1st. We are also, and by doing that, I just want to point out that we're continuing to keep the commercial fishery off of spawning fish. And there have been, you know, many states kind of watching us. They know we have this tremendous biomass that comes into our waters. And that's different than some of the other states. Massachusetts sits on a very important spawning aggregation every late May, early June. And so by not allowing commercial fishing until July 1st, like I said, we are continuing to do what we can to prevent the exploitation of those spawning aggregations by the commercial sector. Now, the rec sector obviously can, but with, again, low trip limits. So we're liberalizing the season opening. We're going to 5 days a week from 3. We're increasing the trip limits. And then, like the fluke proposals, we have these trigger-based increases so that I don't have to come to you in an early September meeting to do some kind of a after a 2-week comment period to come up forward. I mean, the fleet has sort of asked for, or many of the commercial fishing participants like the fact that DMF can adjust as needed. My complaint with that adjustment process is it's really not as timely as it could be or should be. And in other words, sometimes we might get a call from some commercial fishing interests with dealers or fishermen and say, hey, you really should increase that trip limit. And we say to them, well, that sounds great, but our next commission meeting isn't scheduled for 5 or 6 weeks. And then it gets very difficult. So this proposal uses the intelligence that we've developed over the last, handful of years and our understanding of fishing patterns and landings patterns, and creates these utilization or quota-based triggers in a way that we think are going to work quite well. And that is going to the higher trip limit, after September 15th, if we have at least 15% of the quota left. And it also does something we've done recently, which is once the fall hits, let's go to 7 days a week, because, if you think the fluke fishery is a small boat fishery, well, the sea bass fishery is even smaller in terms of average vessel size. And once the winds of September and October come in, it's really not appropriate to be having no fishing days, on a beautiful calm day, and then have an open fishing day when it's blowing a gale. So again, so here are our proposals on the board, and I will be happy. Jared, why don't you fill in if there's anything I didn't mention? I think you've got the asterisk there about the open fishing days for summer flounder. Since we've approved those, then we're going to allow the sea bass retention during those same open fishing days. And if there's anything else I've missed, help me out.
Nope, I've got nothing to add, Dan.
Okay.
So, questions from the member group? Questions on this final recommendation?
Not seeing any questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay, does somebody want to comment?
Not seeing any. Oh, Mike Pearnock.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dan, for your presentation. I wish this was a similarity to the summer flounder, from the sense that black sea bass, they're out there in tremendous numbers. We have them the entire season, and to some extent they do go into deeper water as water temperatures increase, but it's a little bit different than what we observe with the summer flounder. I support this. Hopefully the proposed discussions with the harvest control rule can address those items recreationally. We continue to tear our hair out over MRIP and the status of the stock and seasons and bag limits, but ultimately I'm fine with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions or comments on the recommendation?
Not seeing any further hand raised.
Need a motion? Would somebody like to make a
Motion to accept.
I'll
Thank you,
second.
Lou. Thank you. Who's that, Bill?
That was
Yes.
Lou and Suki, or Lou and Bill. Yeah, Lou and Bill.
Bill Amaru.
Correct.
Okay, roll call vote here. Suki,
Yes.
Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Mike Pearnock,
Yes.
Leo.
Yes.
Well, with no opposition, it's unanimous. Motion carries.
Okay, Ray, next on the agenda is a bluefish size limit. If you recall, the environmental police brought to our attention one of the unintended outcomes of our low bluefish bag limit, just 3 per angler and 5 on for higher vessels.
Pardon me,
was-
Dan, we're out of order here on the agenda. Menhaden was up next, so I don't.
Oh, okay. Yes, you're right. Jared, thank you. Okay. So the final recommendation of a proposal was to begin a June 1st start date for the directed fishery. You can see in the memorandum that the landings were quite high last year during the second half of May. That was related to, in part, an early arrival of fish, but more likely the fishing or the decisions by at least one prominent seiner to take advantage of fish. You know, I don't think these fish were inside on May 5th before June 1st, but they were certainly outside, and those fish were harvested and logged against our quota. You know, the problem with that is it's really the bait. It's the bait industry, which is predominantly used by lobstermen, and the fishery is hardly geared up yet, and the bigger bait demand is later in the season. So we're suggesting a June 1st start date. This wouldn't affect weirs, and this wouldn't affect folks who want to take up to 6,000 pounds in small quantities. We also don't allow seining inside of the inshore net areas until June 1st, because there's typically been incidents and also concerns about river herring bycatch, that if you're seining way up inside before those fish, or when those fish are making their way up into the ladders, you do have a risk of having a bycatch issue. And so we've always had that, but we just think for quota management purposes, it's smarter to start this on June 1st. Jared, any additions?
Nothing to add. I would just add, you know, Maine adopted a similar provision last year to similarly address early harvest and better aligning the bait harvest with the bait demand. And we spoke with our colleagues in Maine on that, and it was a well-supported measure that really achieved what their goal there. So that drove our thinking on this as well.
Thank you, Jared. Questions on the recommendation?
Bill Amaru.
Bill, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dan. Another good presentation. I don't have a question. I have a general statement to make about the lobster fishery and its relationship to the bait in New England. I've been hearing more and more people along the shore who are lobstering and getting ready for the season tell me that the bait this year looks like it's going to be a very significant issue. Availability of bait from cut fish is going down every year with the lower land and ground fish, sadly. Skins or skins from flounder and cod that have been a substantial part of the bait stream are going to be less this year. And I just wanted to say that we have to be very careful that the fishery is managed in such a way that we'll have a continuous flow of fish under regulations, and that hopefully it will supply a significant part of the fleet for the better part of the summer. And that's also true of the mackerel fishery that a handful of us pursue for the summer. Those mackerel are very important to the lobster industry. And I ask you, Dan, if you've heard anything from lobstermen about the scarcity of bait and the very, very high price now that they're paying for their bait needs. Thank you.
Yeah, Bill, thanks for that. I'm not surprised. I have heard some of the same chatter. Of course, the drastic reductions in herring quotas is sort of the driving factor in sort of the overall Northeast base shortage. And so, yeah, it is a challenge. And, you know, one of there's a big problem in Maine that they're confronting, and that is participation in this fishery. And a lot of this allocation, as I understand it, or I'm sorry, a lot of the end result of these of their rules up there are going to make their fishery more of a small scale fishery to meet local needs, as opposed to having, you know, vessels that are predominantly bait harvesters. We still have some boats down here that, especially with the limited entry scheme we have, where we do have boats that are primarily just fishing for bait and supplying bait markets. And, you know, it is always a challenge for us to try to keep everybody happy. And that's going to be our next conversation about Boston Harbor. But yeah, this is a delicate issue, and we're trying to do what we can. Nicola is our lead on the Menhaden board, and there's more to come this year for next year regarding allocations and maybe how we manage this fishery. We're not expecting any drop in our commercial landings as a result of this, but we're going to be facing some rules. But mindful of the need for bait, you can see that's why we're taking this action. We're trying to match the demand with the availability as much as we can.
Questions or comments?
Mike Pearnock.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dan. If I look at figure 1 correctly and interpreting this correctly, in 2017 and 2018, the landings were roughly 5 million pounds. And then in 2020 and 2021, they've gone up to close to 10 million pounds and more than doubled. Is that a result of the fact that Massachusetts has a quota, and then when that quota is achieved, you can get quota from abutting states or for episodic events? And as a result of that, is there a concern that pulsed commercial fishing pressure that's more than doubled is going to have an impact on the availability of that fish within our waters?
So Nicola, I'll call on you to help sort of describe the episodic set aside and transfers. But I hear you, Mike. You know, well, we're not really interested in grabbing a huge increase in quota from Massachusetts. I understand the delicate nature and the fact that there's already a lot of anxiety about the presence of some of the seiners in the inshore waters. But remember, these fish are landed not only from close to shore where many of your constituents fish, but also offshore. So this particular graph is when you described figure 1, that a large amount of fish was actually taken. You know, I'm not even sure that was from state waters. You know, that might have been from just beyond state waters. It could also come from another state, landed here if they have a permit. So it's, you know, and these schools of fish do move from south to north, heading up toward Maine and even Nova Scotia. But we're trying to be as sensitive as we can. You know, our limited entry scheme and the fact that we have, I think, predominantly some pretty responsible harvesters, you know, trying to work in our crowded inshore waters. It's always a struggle, you know, and I'm sensitive to that. But I think you can expect something around 10 million pounds around in the near future, especially if we get a recalibrated quota share. Nicola, can you comment on that?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So Mike is correct that increase in landings in the last couple of years has been driven by first, the change in our regulations that allowed us more easily to take our full quota and then get transfers and also access the episodic set aside, which other states had been using, and we have participated in the last 2 years after our quota has been taken. The addendum that's being pursued by ASMC, looks to incorporate more recent years of landings into the state allocations. So that would result in an increase for Massachusetts. And there's also right now the episodic set aside is at 1%. So some options would increase that up to 5% potentially. I don't think that it's going to be like a large increase in the state quota plus a large increase in the set aside. I think those are two different tools to possibly try to achieve the same thing. But I think it's important to remember that the harvest in New England and increased availability is driven by a healthy stock with more larger fish heading north, that there are ecosystem-based reference points from Medhaven. And while there is interest in understanding that abundance and the regional abundance and regional bait needs, that is a huge data requirement for potentially the next version of the ecosystem-based model that's able to look at more spatial information. So that may be something for the future, but as Dan said, we're mindful of how we're managing this fishery and trying to balance the needs.
Thank you, Nicola. Questions?
Mr. Chairman, I have another question.
By all means.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Nicola. I'm sensitive to the fact that the need for bait for the lobster fleet. And I'm sensitive to the fact that what we're trying to do also is to extend the season in order to have bait available for the lobster fleet. So to bring in the Friday question
I think
about
it's
fishing.
premature. I think you're premature. I think let's approve this opening date and then we can
Well,
talk about the Friday issue in
But it does
Boston.
tie in, if I could just have a moment, if it's okay, it does tie into my basis behind the Friday issue. Is that if we're trying to extend it, the issue about Friday, there's going to be conflicts. That's a secondary issue, no matter what the gear type. But if we close Friday, then you're going to have more days later in the season. Whereas these numbers show there's no lack of the ability to catch those fish even beyond within Boston Harbor. So it provides the ability for more fish later in the season. And then it works for those in the recreational community, because the real issue is that when they go in and fish, they go in and fish Friday, it takes the entire weekend typically for the striped bass or bluefish to stabilize so they come back. That's why we had hoped that they would not be in there Friday. I look at this as a mechanism to accommodate that, as well as a mechanism to extend the season where there's no lack of this fish elsewhere beyond Boston Harbor.
I mean, I don't know what to say, Mike. This is a proposal to open the date, the fishery, direct to fishery on June 1st. It is not a discussion about Boston Harbor specific or having a no fishing day statewide. And I think you're bringing up a Boston Harbor specific issue, which the Fridays is open. It's an open landing day for almost all the state. This is sensitive Boston Harbor issue that you're bringing up, that if Boston Harbor is closed on Fridays, I don't think it has that much effect on the landings, because presuming those fish are elsewhere, Gloucester, Salem, out the EEZ, out in the 0 to 3 mile band, that's an open fishing day. So I think you might be you might be missing the mark on terms of the impact that Boston Harbor Friday is going to have on quota. I'm not seeing it that way. But I think the commission should try to take a final action on the June 1st date, and then we can have a substantive discussion on the Boston Harbor Friday problem.
Thank you, Dan. Any questions for the director on this final recommendation?
Not seeing any other comments or hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Well, I'll need a motion.
Yeah, Suki, I'll make a motion to extend the date to June 1st.
Thank you,
I'll-
Suki.
I'll second it. Lou
Thank you.
Williams.
Thank you, Lou. Okay, all those in favor, Suki,
Yes.
Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Bill Amaru. Bill? Mike Pearnock,
Yes.
Khalil,
Yes.
and I'll come back to Bill Amaru.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Thank you, Bill.
Yes, I'm having a little stuff going on, but I'm still here. Yes, I vote yes.
Thank you, Bill. All the members have voted in favor, no opposition. Motion carries. Okay, we can move on to, or did you want to have a discussion on this Boston Harbor Friday fishery, Dan, or?
Well,
we move
I think we could. I mean, I think
Okay.
Mike, yeah, let's spend 5 or 10 minutes on this, only because I know it's a really difficult topic and something people are pretty passionate about. So as stated in the memo, Boston Harbor was closed about 12 years ago or so, or maybe more. And it was done especially at the request of some of the charter boats who complained about one particular seiner who actually was fishing illegally behind a closure line. But, you know, we, at the time, Director Diodati used the authority of permit conditions and excluded, you know, fishing on Fridays from Boston Harbor. And at the time that we didn't have as a robust a fishery as we do now, but, you know, that was his action. And I think everybody was satisfied with that. Now, each of these harbors can be, or the permit conditions can be kind of tailored to, you know, whatever the issues are. And I just want to remind the commission that this fishery is regulated by a whole bunch of very detailed permit conditions, many of which have evolved over the decades in the result of negotiations between Director Coates, Director Diodati, the environmental police, the fishermen. It's a difficult fishery to manage because you're talking about, you know, kind of large schools of fish being extracted from, you know, outside of a mooring area or up in, you know, in a river or near a river mouth. And, you know, you don't usually see, you know, fish being extracted, you know, at that scale, so close to shore. On the other hand, we know that this fish is also known to produce some horrific problems with oxygen depletion and midsummer fish kills. And so when we do have a fish kill with you know, on a stretch of cloudy days and the oxygen's used up by large bodies of fish, it's a nightmare. And so, you know, this is very delicate when I think we've been pretty successful, you know, keeping the peace and getting the work done of producing bait. We have a grandfathered system here where those participants who have permits are those who have been involved with the fishery over time. The one relatively new participant is a small scale harvester out of Hull, and by all accounts, he's a gentleman and extremely popular even among the recreational sector. So it was a request that I received from him, and it was bolstered by some other recreational fishermen, that to allow, you know, I won't say him, but allow fishing on Friday. Obviously, it's his local waters. Some of the other boats come from distant ports. And because on Fridays, he was, if he wanted to fish from Menhaden, he was traveling to Salem or to Gloucester or other places. He's got a small boat, so he's mostly suited for fishing, close to shore, up to 25,000 pound trip limit. So I made the decision to allow that last year, but there's always been a strong opposition to any nearshore Menhaden harvest by many of the advocates for the forage base, many of the striped bass fishery participants. And then last year, there was not as many fish in some of the other northern harbors, and many of these vessels participated in the Boston Harbor fishery, not just on Fridays, but other days of the week as well. There was some complaints about that. We got some pictures about one particular boat that was fishing very close to some recreational boats. And then there was a video presented to us, and it appeared that the boat set right in the middle of a bunch of recreational fishermen. And one of the permit conditions, which is a little bit nebulous, but I inherited it from Phil Coates, and I do appreciate all the peacemaking that he went through. And I'm the beneficiary of some of this. I would call it a treaty. The language said that concentrations of recreational fishermen, shall be avoided. And well, this particular seiner did not do that in the least, and it was pretty aggressive. And so I wrote to him, as you have seen a couple months ago, and informed him that I've reviewed this, and as a result, I'm going to condition his permit and not allow him into Boston Harbor this year. I believe I've solved the problem of those kind of interactions. Many of the advocates for Boston Harbor charter boats feel that there shouldn't be any Menhaden seining inside Boston Harbor. The jury's out. I believe that getting these guys to behave, or this one boat to behave, is in everybody's best interest. I had a meeting with that captain yesterday. We went over a whole bunch of issues, and so I would like to continue this year. I'd like to keep Fridays open. I think by putting everybody on notice, all the 5 or 6 seiners who are active in the state, who have the authority to go in there, that we mean business. And if we continue to see problems, then I'll have a different outlook. But from all that I could see, there were no complaints about the other vessels. There was a complaint about the fishing style of this particular vessel. And so the other thing I'm planning on doing in this year's permit conditions is not allow carriers inside of Boston Harbor. And so, that will be another way to kind of constrain the removals from the Boston Harbor complex. So if the commission wants to, weigh in on this, I'm all ears. I really think this is the appropriate thing to do. I think we nipped it in the bud, and if it gets worse, then I will certainly consider doing something. I'll even consider doing something in season if conflicts proliferate. One of the complaints that the seiners have brought to me is that they allege that if the recreational vessels see a school, they may just steam over and sit on it, which kind of protects the school. And I can't believe that happens a lot, or that's valid. There's better things to do than to be running around hassling a seiner. But that's their allegation. So it's, in any conflict, there's 2 sides. I really want both parties to get along. I really think that the responsible operators who are respectful of the recreational harvesters deserve a chance to continue to fish in there. And I'd like to give it another year at least. So that's my speech. If the commission wants to weigh in on this, and if you really feel differently, I'm all ears. So let's have this brief discussion if you'd like, Ray.
Thank you, Dan. Questions or comments for the director?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Just a point of clarification, Dan, is that prohibited on carrier vessels just Fridays, or is that at all times in Boston Harbor?
Yeah, that would be at all times in Boston Harbor.
Okay. I think
Thank
people
you.
are aware of that, but anyway. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Suki. Questions or comments?
Mike Piernock,
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dan. We appreciate your efforts on this sensitive matter and what you've conducted within the past year to try to address the conflicts recreationally or commercially with who's fishing within this area. And I think that there's always going to be conflicts. We try to minimize such. It's just unfortunately the way it is. Within commercially or recreationally, there's conflicts. So, but I appreciate your efforts to try to address that. But I look at this a little differently, or we look at this a little differently. As noted, if a vessel, commercial vessel goes in there Monday through Thursday, that's 4 days they're in there. And when that happens on that Friday, that the whole weekend is impacted, and it takes time for the striped bass or bluefish or other fish to come back and stabilize. Unfortunately, as a result of that, the fish aren't there, and people aren't going to go fishing. People aren't going to go on for-hire vessels, and all of those that rely on that are negatively impacted. And there's a financial impact to such. My comments earlier looked at the fact that this conflict issue is secondary. Primary is the fact of what this does to the fishery, and that pulse commercial fishing pressure, how it impacts Boston Harbor. And the fact that there is no lack of menhaden beyond those waters, and we've more than doubled the landings from 5 million to 10 million, or I don't have it in front of me, but more than doubled the past 2 years. The need for them to go in there to catch their fish to exceed the state harvest level, as well as to get the episodic levels or adjacent states to use their quota, is such that that's the disconnect. So I look at it as a way to meet in the middle and make this work for all, is to not have them in there on Fridays. And it would provide the ability for the for-hire fleet and recreational fleet to be able to not have their fishery in that area impacted as a result of the purse seining. So I guess we're going to have to agree to disagree. I'm open to any more discussion or comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, Mike, all I could say is that I will pay really close attention to this. I've even pledged to go out on one of the seiners myself and see this firsthand. So I'm not closing the book on it. I'm open-minded. I get it.
Lou Williams,
Lou, you're recognized.
Yeah, I was just, going back to the last one with the June 1st opening of the fishery, where, we're trying to extend the lobster bait. It's going to be an issue. Last year, I mean, we were getting a lot of redfish heads at times from Russia, and I don't think that'll be happening this year. But if you just by one aspect of this compared to last year, what I see, if you eliminate any carrier vessels, there was one there that could do 250,000 a day. That's like 1.1 million pounds a week. That's 10% of the quota we're not taking out of Boston Harbor compared to last year without a carrier vessel. So, so I think for the small operators, this should work for them. Thanks.
Thank you, Lou. Any other comments?
not seeing any further comments, Mr. Chair. This doesn't need a vote.
No, this was just a discussion.
Just a discussion tangential to the action item on the season. So we can proceed to bluefish.
Yes, we can move on with the agenda. Bluefish minimum size. Dan?
Thanks, Ray. As proposed, the agency is recommending the adoption of a 16-inch commercial minimum size for bluefish. This is 2 inches smaller than our neighboring state in the state of Rhode Island, and it addresses, not a conservation issue per se, but a unintended consequence of what was reported to us by law enforcement of some anglers that weren't satisfied with the 3 fish limit, and we're seeking to take large quantities of snapper bluefish, those under around a pound or so, or in that area. And they were doing so legally by buying a commercial permit. And obviously that is a real problem for the assessment, because if those fish are being targeted and then not even incorporated into the commercial landings because they're being used for personal use, it just wreaks havoc on the data gathering aspects and is inconsistent with the intent of the rule. So we are recommending a 2-inch smaller size limit to satisfy the concerns of the one strike netter who he didn't want this minimum size to result in a whole lot of extra work in terms of him having to cull the fish. We don't think it will. We think that based on the old sea sampling work that we've done on his boat, that particular gear, which is depicted in the photo, that only larger fish are retained by that net. But nonetheless, we think it'd be a good tool for environmental police to be able to use to root out this recreational or subsistence fishing going on under the guise of a commercial permit. And it also wouldn't affect the tuna fishery. Jared, do you want to speak to that tuna fishery question because of that recreational and commercial confusion?
Yeah, so that was an interesting question and a good discussion that came up at the public hearing. Was if you're going to take bait to go fish in the bluefin tuna fishery, you're conducting a commercial fishing, potentially conducting a commercial fishing trip should you hook a giant. At which point, state rules, we have a regulation that prohibits commercial fishing and recreational fishing to occur on the same trip. But in consideration of the kind of opportunistic nature of the bluefin tuna fishery, we intentionally exempted them from that prohibition to mix recreational and commercial fishing trips because, there's a lot of charter boats that will do dual tuna striped bass trips, and we didn't want to limit the ability to do that. Plus, the bluefin tuna fishery is a fairly opportunistic fishery in that you may not be catching a giant on any given trip. So with those two things in consideration, we exempted the tuna fishery from that. So if you're using bluefish for tuna bait, say if you're on a charter, you can retain bluefish under the 16-inch minimum size, and you can retain up to 5 bluefish per angler. So if you have a 6-pack charter, that gives you up to 30 bluefish under 16 inches that you could keep for bait purposes. Or if you wanted to retain larger bluefish, you could do that as well if you were commercially permitted. So we think it addresses it. We do not think that this 16-inch minimum size is going to negatively impact the retention of bluefish for tuna bait. Perhaps at the private angler level, if you're not a commercial angler with a 3-fish limit, and if there were only a small number of anglers on board, you may have to rely on other bait sources such as mackerel or menhaden. For the tuna fishery, as that 3-fish limit might not be sufficient. But we think at least for the larger scale for the for-hire fleet that the rules as written would work to allow for minimum size on the commercial end and to accommodate the retention of small bluefish as tuna bait.
Thank you, Jared. Questions or comments?
Mike Beardock?
Michael, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jared. This is a job well done to pull this all together and clarify it at various levels. The need for enforcement, as noted, is understood. I just throw out there more for the commercial hook and line per se, or the smaller boats that you'll see on Buzzards Bay, Vineyard Sound, Nantucket Sound, and so on. Maybe the answer here is to help with enforcement, and I know to help with the public and the community of who really is commercially fishing is that, such as if you're a charter headboat vessel, a state permitted vessel, you get a decal that you place in the front of your boat. If the same was required for bluefish, summer flounder, black sea bass, and so on, that could then help identify who's really fishing commercially or recreationally and help with enforcement from the public who keeps an eye on such, as well as with enforcement. I throw that out there as some food for thought and maybe a mechanism to try to address this, but at multiple levels with bluefish and other species. But I do thank you for all your efforts with this. This is well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions or comments, Jared?
I'm not seeing any.
And we'll need a motion.
Bill Doyle, motion to approve as presented.
Thank you, Bill. Seconded by,
Shelley Edmondson, second.
thank you, Shelley. Okay, roll call vote. Suki,
Yes.
Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Mike Beardnock,
Yes.
Leo.
Yes.
No opposition. The membership has voted unanimously in favor. Moving on.
Hey, Ray, the next issue is a very short one. The New England Council and ASMFC have both recommended Mid-Atlantic and New England Council, as well as ASMFC, have all approved an increase of the dogfish trip limit from 6,000 to 7,500 pounds. And we would like to enact a complementary rule for Massachusetts.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Deb, but I think I saw a notice yesterday from NOAA saying that they have adopted this.
That's right.
Yes.
So this would just allow vessels fishing in the federal zone to land that trip limit in state waters, and any vessel fishing in state waters to be afforded that higher limit should dogfish be in state waters.
Questions or comments?
Not seeing any, Mr. Chair.
Need a motion.
Motion to accept, Lou Williams.
Thank
Oh, I
you.
would second the motion, Bill Amaru.
Thank you, Bill. Roll call vote. Suki,
Yes.
Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Mike Beardnock,
Yes.
Leo.
Yes.
No opposition amongst the membership, unanimous vote in favor. We can move on.
Thank you, Ray. Next is under a title called Regulatory Housekeeping. So these are some technical corrections to our regulations, and there's two. And I would like Jared Silva to present on those, since Jared is the kind of the mechanic that that has to fix regulations when they aren't functioning as intended.
Sure. So the first one's a particular of particular interest to me. So maybe 10 years ago, we enacted a regulation that stated that on for-hire trips, if violations of the recreational fishing limits occur, then the captain, operator, or patrons may each be held responsible for such violations. Previously, this could be done under Chapter 130, Section 1, but at the request of law enforcement following some fairly substantial non-compliance events in the South Coast scup sea bass fishery. Law enforcement asked us to clarify. It came through the law enforcement subcommittee of the commission that there was a need to clarify that the operators or permit holders could also be held responsible. And we did so. And in those conversations, concerns were raised from the head boat fleet in particular, that given the scale of those operations, they're not equipped to enforce rules on a 60, 70 person operation. And they were concerned that, should there be a small handful of people on their vessel, that they may be held responsible and may face permit sanctions or criminal or civil charges for those violations. And there was a lot of discussion following that about officer discretion. And, there were some enforcement incidents that were going on that preceded this where, there were large scale, fairly obvious violations on head boats. And that was what this was targeting, and not necessarily, incidental non-compliance or small scale non-compliance that an officer wouldn't necessarily hold the operator responsible for. And out of this conversation grew a interest or a desire to have the idea or concept of officer discretion embedded in the regulation. So we adopted some language that said that Massachusetts Environmental Police may use their discretion when enforcing this rule should best practices be used, which is the announcing rules and the posting of rules. And that really doesn't do anything different than what they were already going to do. Officer discretion is a pretty complex area of law enforcement, and it basically allows them to look at to situationally enforce laws and regulations. And we know our officers do this, and we break rules with the understanding that this is going to be done. But in adopting that language there, it's awkward because it's the only place in our code of regulations that we address officer discretion. So in an adjudicatory hearing this past year, this came up, and what the lawyer was luckily unsuccessfully arguing was that because we give deference to officer discretion here and we don't do it elsewhere in our regulations, that should a charter boat or a head boat claim that they have followed the best management practices, and there's testimony from the patrons that they have done that they are not responsible for any of the conduct that happens on their boat. And that's exactly the opposite of what we were trying to achieve with this. And I was thankful that the magistrate sided with me in the interpretation of this rule, and that individual was found responsible and had sanctions taken against their permit. But in the broader scope of things, it made me think that it's probably a good opportunity to rescind that language regarding officer discretion, given that it's already a concept that's widely used in law enforcement, and the inclusion of that language in only this regulation only serves to muddy the waters and make this more confusing. I don't think we will lose any, or there's going to be a bump in a different approach to law enforcement with us rescinding that rule. And I think Lieutenant Bass would agree with me on that. That the boots on the ground officers aren't going to look at enforcing for-hire regulations any differently on head boats. It's just going to clarify. It's just going to make the rule more clear and have less gray area that perhaps another judge or magistrate would rule differently on. So our recommendation is just to rescind the language regarding officer discretion from the for-hire liability regulation. I'll take questions or comments.
Any questions or comments for Jared on this? This is not an action item.
Chair. Yeah, we need a motion on this and the next item, Mr. Chair.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Jared.
Ray, would you
know,
like us to go to the second issue and you can make a motion on the two housekeeping measures?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Okay. The second housekeeping measure is, as you may recall, last year we prohibited the use of traps, six-sided traps, not open star traps or open top traps, but six-sided traps for the taking of blue crabs. And with that, there are no other species of edible crabs that may be taken by a trap gear that isn't lobster trap gear. So the other species of edible crabs being, or the other genus of edible crabs being cancer crabs, rock crabs, and Jonah crabs. And whereas there's not a blue crab trap fishery anymore, we just want to clarify that if you're going to take edible crabs, rock crabs, Jonah crabs, then they need to be, then those recreational traps need to be configured as lobster traps. We can't have a new trap designed to catch this other species or that may catch lobsters as bycatch. So if you're going to be fishing recreational traps, they're going to be configured as lobster traps, and you may keep the Jonah or rock crab catch as bycatch. We didn't do this historically because there was that second type of trap, the blue crab trap, that was being fished. But now that blue crab trapping is prohibited, we want to just kind of tie that together and eliminate any gray area there. And that's consistent with how the commercial fishery is managed as well. So those are the two housekeeping recommendations. Suki?
I'd like to make a motion to recommend to both motions.
I have a question before we get a motion on the floor, Jared.
Sure.
Yeah, I saw a list of regulatory housekeeping. I believe I read a list in our reading materials, and one that's important to lobstermen down here on the Cape is the transport of their product from the dock to the mortar building where they're selling.
So there's three permitting items that come up that don't require commission approval, and that is one of them that we're going to discuss more informally. So these are the two that require commission approval. The other, the owner operator is a permitting requirement, which falls under the director's sole discretion, so it's not part of this motion. But it will be addressed in like 2 slides from now.
Okay, thank you, Jared. I'm sorry, Suki. So Suki made a motion. I need a second.
Bill Amaru?
Thank you, Bill. Roll
Bill.
call vote.
Mr. Chair, Bill, is that a question or a comment, or are you seconding the motion?
Bill, are you with us?
Sorry about that. I was muted. My question is, does the title cancer crab cover what we call the Jonah and the other rock crabs?
Yes, it's the genus for both of those crab
Okay,
species.
that was my only question because I know they're both being taken. Thank you.
So we still need a second.
I seconded it, Ray.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Roll call vote. Suki,
Yes.
Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Mike Pearnock,
Yes.
Khalil.
Yes.
No opposition by the membership, unanimous vote in favor. So now we can move on, or did we want to discuss these other? Or that's coming down the road. Okay, striped bass control date.
Yeah,
Yeah, so thank you. Oh, go ahead, Jared.
I was just gonna say, Mr. Chair, we've moved on to number 5 on the agenda, consultation of commercial permitting decisions. These are the 3 items that went out to public hearing that are permitting issues that we want to consult with the commission on, but don't require a commission vote. So they've kind of been parsed out from that housekeeping action.
Thank you, Jared.
Yeah, so Ray, the first one is the striped bass control date. Our current control date is almost decade old.
Yeah, September 13th, 2000, or September 9th, 2013.
Yeah. And so as been depicted in the memo, we have a trend in the striped bass landings over the last 3 years where more and more fish are being taken in a different part of the state. It used to be predominantly Cape and Islands and South Shore, and now it's the majority is, or at least half the fish has been north of Boston. And so a control date is a date that we may use should we want to limit participation, as we've done in the past, what this commission has done with tautog. So we limited participation in the tautog fishery by requiring only those who had already held the permit for a certain number of years and had recorded landings be eligible to continue in the fishery. I don't anticipate right now needing to limit participation in the striped bass fishery. Having said that, we do issue about 4 times more, maybe 4 or 5 times more permits than people who actually land fish. But and with the new amendment coming, it's conceivable that we may have to take a cut in the commercial quota. At this time, I don't see any need to limit participation, but if we did, I think it would be it's always disruptive when you do that, but it could be even objectionable if we required some kind of a history of landings going back. And the fact that this control date goes back to 2013, if we use that date, we could have conceivably fishermen participating in the fishery for 9 or 10 years since the control date that could be excluded. So I would like the commission to sort of endorse my enactment of a new control date that would be used. That may be used. We would put everyone who is a covenant participant and a future applicant on notice that the new control date would be, just prior to this upcoming season, June 14th, 2022. And that would be the line in the sand that should we decide to limit participation, it would be based on participation prior to that date, which would be much more modern in terms of not only the recent participants, but also help to incorporate maybe some people in parts of the state where the fishery is more robust now. So I'm only looking for kind of the blessing of the commission and a nod to do this.
Questions or comments for Dan? This is a discussion item or a consultation item. This is not an action item.
Not seeing any comments or questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So I presume, Dan, that the subcommittee will be looking at this down the road, depending on, what is it, Amendment 7 coming out of ASMSC by October.
Yeah, that's right. There's no action that I can see as imminent, but a 9-year-old control date, I don't believe is really appropriate. So it's just a good idea to refresh that. I really can't forecast where the commercial fishery management is going, but it's just, I think, more responsible to have fresher control dates.
Right. Thank you. Okay, owner operator clarifications.
Mr. Chair, there's actually a question from Bill Amory now.
Bill, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Dan has done here. That modern date is going to be a lot more equitable. But I would like to recommend that the commission and anyone listening realize that when these dates go into effect and people inevitably lose access, as I did, I'm going to use my own experience. I lost a general category scout permit, and I lost access to tautog. Not that it made a huge difference in my overall capacities, but it does to some people. It's going to mean a hit, and I want just everybody to bear in mind that individual fishermen are affected by the actions that we take, and that Dan will have to take at some point, and do the best they can internally with their own judgments. I think the work is being done very well by the division, and the thought process and the equitability is evident. But let's just keep in mind, though, that people will be lowered in their ability to earn a living when we make these actions. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could comment, Bill, I mean, yeah, the flip side of that coin is you've got a lot of recreational fishermen buying the endorsements. So if they do come across a pot of large fish, then they ultimately decide to land those fish commercially. They never get reported and they get given away to their friends, but they're not reported. So, I mean, it's a two-headed snake that we're dealing with on a state level. And down at ASMFC, other commission members will look and ask, have you really got 4,000 commercial striped bass fishermen in the state of Massachusetts? When I think realistically, active fishermen might be 1,200 of the 4,000. So we have data issues and enforcement issues when you've got that many permits out there that really aren't commercial permits. They're bought as such, but they're not applied as such. That's just my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I don't oppose this. It's part of the necessary actions that are required as populations increase and pressure increases on the fisheries. And we may not on the federal level have dealt with the groundfish issues that we have to now. Of course, that's exclusive of water temperature changes. If we had acted more aggressively earlier, I mean, everybody talks about how that could have happened, but it didn't until it was a little bit too late. So no, I agree with what Dan has done. I just want everyone to understand that there are within that mix of people who will lose access, some who will be turned away from a fishery that would be legitimately operated in. Hopefully not very many anyway.
Thank you, Bill. Any other comments?
Mike Beardock?
Michael?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with this measure and what's been stated. I do have a question, though, for Dan and Jarrett. What are the statistics for these reported so-called recreational anglers that are permitted to commercially fish that are not reporting? I'd be interested in what percentage of the population that represents. Thank you.
Jared, I think Story did some analysis on that for the last striped bass subcommittee. Story, do you want to?
Yeah, it depends on the question. So if the question is how much of the fish reported by fishermen is for personal use, it was very low, like under 1 or 2%. What we don't know is what might be unreported. So we just obviously don't know that. But the amount reported for personal consumption was very low. And Jared, we have that in a presentation somewhere. I don't have it right in front of me, but we can provide that.
Yeah, why don't we continue on the next issue and we can bring that up, later in the meeting if because it's just a discussion item. But let's proceed with the agenda, Ray. The next one is owner operator clarification, which is the issue you were concerned about. And Jared, do you have some discussion of that because you've been involved with the environmental police on a need for clarification?
Yep. So there's two items here that are the permanent clarifications. The first being the owner operator rule that was previously discussed. So what was asked at the November law enforcement subcommittee meeting was for DMF to provide some clarification on whether or not the owner operator requirement extended past actual commercial fishing activity on the vessel to the bringing of fish to market for sale. We went out to public hearing with the most restrictive rule, which would have required the named permit holder be in possession of the catch until sale to the primary buyer, which would have included bringing the fish off the boat to the truck or trucking the fish over land to a dealer. We received a public comment on that from an individual who participates in a number of trap fisheries, all of which are on our operator: lobster trap, sea bass, pot, conch pot, and they requested that we not extend that past the commercial fishing activity and continue to allow or to allow deckhands or individuals working under the employ of the permit holder to bring that fish to market. That provided, he argued that provides the permit holder with the opportunity to work on the vessel as necessary, and thereby does not extend their weekly hours of work, having to truck the fish for market and then come back and maintain the vessel. We thought that was a fair comment and a fair criticism of the most restrictive proposal. We reached out to those individuals in law enforcement who serve as on the law enforcement subcommittee and got their take on it. They support to summarize the point of view from law enforcement, and Matt, if I get this wrong, please interrupt me, was basically they were looking for, they saw clarification and were pretty agnostic as to which way we went at the end, provided that we just clarified whether or not it applied. So with that comment in mind and with that feedback from law enforcement, the clarification is going to be that the owner-operator requirement does not extend past commercial fishing activity on the vessel, thereby allowing a deckhand or someone under the employ of the permit holder to bring the fish to market without the owner being there. The second permitting clarification came up this past year with regards to the exceptionally late renewal application for one individual limited entry permit endorsement. And the regulation effectively reads that limited entry regulated permit endorsements are not postmarked or received by DMF prior to 12 a.m. on the last day of February may be approved. That's to give the director the discretion to approve or not approve that. We think it reads better and more consistent with our approach to this to have it read may not. And that just came out of our internal conversation regarding that permit application and our ultimate denial to renew those permits as part of that late permit application. So those are the two permitting clarifications we intend to make, and I'll take comments or questions on those. Mr. Chair, I see Lou Williams.
Lou, you're recognized.
I just giving an example of, I think everyone like myself, we go out, we come in, we unload at the dock. But back in the 80s, I fished out of my hometown in Swampscott, and we had a reefer box truck, and every other day we put the fish on and send them to the Portland auction. And I had a friend of my father's who was retired who drove the truck. So I think it's a good idea to have this because everybody isn't tied to a wharf where they're taking out their fish, so I think it's a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Comments?
Not seeing any further comments, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and I support both of these actions, especially that second one. I know I got a phone call a few years ago, and it was an ask, and they had missed the February 28th deadline date for striped bass. And I said, well, I'm sorry, it's not my purview. And this way, the director can't play favorites when it reads on the last day of February may not be approved. I mean, it's written as such, as opposed to the discretion of the director. That's when you get stories coming back about why is one person treated in such a manner and the next person not treated equally. So I like both of these clarifications. Thank you.
Okay, Ray, those
Yeah.
are, if that's all the comments, then we can move on to the discussion items. I don't know if you want to take a short break.
We're going to take a 10-minute break right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Jared, 10-minute break.
Can do. I'll post it up.
Thank you.
Ready to
Well,
get,
ladies and gentlemen, going to reconvene this meeting. Discussion items, protected species updates.
Hey, Ray, let me kick off this discussion by first bringing the commission up to date on the ropeless fishing issues within Massachusetts. I mentioned in my introductory remarks that I sent a letter of denial to a small set of fishermen and their administrator, Ms. Laurie Karen, on Monday at the end of the day, to relative to their request to fish 10 trawls, each 5 different fishermen in a combination of state and federal waters. And I've given you a 7-page memo. I've given her a 3-page letter detailing our concerns and our reasons. And needless to say, this is a very, very divisive issue. There are many in the conservation community that think that this was, not the right decision, that we should have been approving this in order to enhance the development of this technology. There are a vast majority of commercial lobstermen who believe that that our decision was the right one. But I just want to go over a few of the key background issues on this. So this was a request for a letter of authorization. We don't have a regulation that would really allow fishing in a closed area, but the federal government does. And in their recent large whale take reduction plan rules that were enacted mid-year, last summer or so, they amended their rules that altered their fishery closures, their lobster fishery closures, to, instead of being a closure to lobster traps, it was a closure to lobster traps with persistent buoy lines. And in that decision, they described a process that they're going to create for an EFP. Now, what does EFP stand for? It stands for exempted fishing permit, but it's often given when fishing is done on an experimental basis. So the E often gets confused. Is it experimental or is it exempted? And I think that that captures a big part of the problem that I was having with this. And I will confess, I lost some sleep over trying to figure this out. But in essence, the 5 petitioners, or the 5 applicants, wanted, and they still have an application into NIMS, of course, for the federal portion, but they wanted an opportunity to deploy this gear, and they were going to collect data, consistent with some data collection protocols that was laid out by the federal gear team. But I didn't see the federal gear team really involved with this. I really saw this as an opportunity to fish in an exempted fashion with gear that was loaned to them by the federal government. And it was that the federal government doesn't have a whole lot of these ropeless devices that could outfit the entire fleet. So this was really kind of a hybrid of an experimental activity and an exempted activity. And I have to confess, I was uncomfortable with that. The limited opportunities for the rest of the fleet to work really troubled me. The fact that there wasn't a good experimental design that was going to answer any of the questions that face us. Noah Oppenheim's report I mentioned earlier about the feasibility of what we call on-demand gear in New England lobster fisheries highlights a lot of the challenges that have to be figured out before this thing can really be adopted. And I really felt that this was not scalable, that what they were trying to do was to fish in very discrete areas. They were going to address the problem of gear conflicts by simply choosing a piece of bottom where there wouldn't be any dragging or scalloping. Well, that's logical, but it really isn't scalable. And I fear that the proponents for this, including many of the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and many of which are litigants, really saw this as just another step forward to prove that ropeless fishing works. But I didn't feel that this particular activity was appropriate for state waters because of all the reasons that I've outlined in the memo. And so I saw this primarily as a request to go fishing, and while they're at it, they would collect some scientific data. But this needs to be done in a much more deliberate fashion to actually get answers to many of the questions. So what are the questions? How close can you set a ropeless trawl next to another ropeless trawl? I mean, right now, lobstermen go out and they can look at the buoy lines and they can they know how close they are. Based on the depth, they know how close they need to get before they cross over. I mean, crossovers do happen in the fishery, but when it happens in the nearshore fishery, it's not so dangerous. When it happens in the deep water fishery, it can be very dangerous. And so I just didn't feel that the advocates for ropeless who think that my decision was a terrible decision, I really don't think that they're giving some of these other issues that have been identified by NOAA enough attention. And so I am absolutely willing to issue letters of authorization, as I've done before, to the National Marine Fisheries Service gear team to conduct gear trials in state waters. But this wasn't a gear trial coordinated by the government. This was an opportunity for the applicants to fish, to kind of prove that they're on the cutting edge. They're the early adopters, and they were going to be cheered on by the advocates for ropeless fishing, including using gear that each fisherman's gear was going to be worth about $40,000, with another $5,000 of equipment in the wheelhouse. And to outfit the entire fleet in Massachusetts with this kind of gear, you're looking at least $80 million. And that's a serious number. It's actually probably a low number, because that's just to have a ropeless or an on-demand system on one end of a trawl. And most lobstermen know that they want to be able to haul from either end, depending on tide and wind. And so it could be twice that. And that's just for the state waters fishery. So, many fishermen feel this is an existential threat to their fishery. I mean, it might come with time, but if this were adopted or mandated, very soon, I think it would eliminate many fishermen, including the small scale fishermen, which typically fish in the areas that are being requested by the pioneers. So it's my intention to sit down with some of our critics and try to go over some of these issues in more detail. I'm not sure I'll be convincing, but that's my backstory. Bob, Glenn, is there anything you would like to weigh in on this or comment on that I didn't?
Yeah, Dan, there's one thing that I would like to comment on relative to this issue, and this is something that I think is there's a fairly large public misperception about. Ropeless fishing in a closed area does not solve a whale conservation problem. Okay, so the area is closed. There are no buoy lines there. By allowing ropeless fishing there, you're not enhancing conservation to right whales. And so from comments I've seen online and relative to different ropeless articles in the newspaper about ropeless fishing, there's a misperception that the state is somehow, the DMF is somehow preventing whale conservation from moving forward. When that narrative couldn't be any more false. Essentially, DMF is at the forefront of it. The federal government over the next 10 years has mandated that all fixed gear fisheries reduce risk to North Atlantic right whales by 90%. DMF achieved that last year. So we're not facing an imminent whale conservation issue in state waters that we have to deal with this type of technology at this point. That doesn't mean that it's not appropriate in other areas and that we can't support research to find out, and learn more about the necessary elements of ropeless fishing so it can be applied in areas where it's needed. But from our perspective, it's just not something that we need to address an acute issue either for the fishery or for whales in state waters at this time. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, Bob, and I'll follow up. The commission will recall a memo we wrote to you a year ago on ropeless fishing, and if you recall, we were inundated with comments about ropeless fishing when we were simply trying to enact the routine right whale conservation rules, such as the closures and the weak rope and all that. But we got inundated with ropeless comments, and a lot of it was organized by one of the NGOs and a lobbying firm. But it's a free country. People are free to comment, and that's fine. But we are taking this, as Bob said, very seriously. And I agree with Bob. This information is really needed, and I would cite the California experience, where when California pondered ropeless fishing, they mandated that any ropeless fishing has to address potential gear conflicts, and also the ability of enforcement to detect the presence of the traps. And this particular proposal really didn't. All they did was agree to hide the gear in some untowable bottom, but they didn't really address the gear conflict issue. I guess you could argue that one way to address the gear conflict issue is to only allow 5 guys in a big ocean, because that'll minimize gear conflict because there's so few of them. But as reported in the Oppenheim report, this type of gear has never been really tested in densely fished areas. The kind of densely fished areas that we all know happen in state waters with the commercial lobstermen fishing, the 40-foot vessels, down to the open boat fishermen, who might be in 28-footers, and also the student lobstermen, and then the recreational lobstermen. That's all going on near shore. And as Bob pointed out, we've reduced risk to extraordinary amounts already. And so we were just concerned that this was being portrayed as a solution for the near shore waters, when I don't really think we need that solution. And I also want to remind the commission of a vote that you took a year ago, when we had proposed to you to force lobstermen who were in vessels 20 under 29 feet, I believe was the cutoff, or 29 feet less. But there was a cutoff that we were proposing that those vessel owners would have to, or permit holders in vessels that size, would have to go or could fish singles, and anybody on larger boats would fish trawls. And the answer we got was from fishermen, was like, okay, well, if you do that, I'm going to buy a smaller boat. And so, what that meant was making fishing, more dangerous. So I think of that, and I think of where could this go in the future. And I'm thinking, okay, if the parties who desire universal ropeless fishing prevail, then it's clear that this ropeless fishing on scale could only possibly work on trawls, and fairly long trawls. And so if you brought this rule to the beach, which includes the areas where the pioneers wanted to fish, zones right up to the beach. If you brought that to the beach, you're probably making fishing unprofitable for those small vessel operators. So if you as a commission, or any other regulator, looks at that and says, well, that's too impactful, we probably don't need that gear to be deployed this close to shore on this small suite of on the vessels that are on the smaller end, I think we're going to wind up in the same situation. We would inevitably ponder a rule that says, well, the small boat fleet probably doesn't need to do this because they fish lightweight gear and it's close to shore, and on and on and on. So I just see this as being almost unworkable in the nearshore fishery. And so getting back to Bob's point, this proposal from the pioneers and their advocates, if this was going to, be a pilot program, for lack of a better word, that we just talked about earlier on some other fishery issues, if this was going to be a pilot program, I really I have trouble imagining that that I could get such a final rule enacted with a commission like yours, because under 17A, you as a commission absolutely have the authority to decide on the times, manners, and places of fishing, and that's what this is about. So if we achieve, or we desire to have a heterogeneous fleet, it really baffles me how ropeless fishing could fit into a model where we accommodate vessels of various size if this ropeless configuration is really only affordable for the long trawl fishermen. So you can see the dilemma that we had. You can see the angst. Nobody wants extinction, and I know that the lobstermen are concerned that this is sort of being misinterpreted as commercial fishermen don't want to save whales, or that they want to see this population driven down further, which is absolutely not true. And that's why we have the closures and the weak ropes. And I will remind the commission that we did increase this population by almost 70% from the period 1996 to 2010, since the population has declined, not by 70%, but close to that. And that's by and large related to many of these whales relocating to new places where they're vulnerable. And of course, the ship strikes that have taken them. We've had 3 whale carcasses come into in-state waters that were likely caused by ship strikes, beginning in 99, and then 2 in the last, I think, 6 or 7 years. So, I'm hopeful that the rules as enacted, the closures in combination with weak rope and the increased calving rate that we've seen this year, we have another 15 this year, somehow allow us to crawl out of this mess and out of this hole. But this is a really difficult issue that the commercial fishermen are really struggling with, and it has huge costs and really could turn lobster fishery management on its ear, especially in regard to the inability of law enforcement to inspect the gear if it has no buoy lines, because you can't haul it to the surface, and all the safety issues that go along with it. So I guess at this point we'll take questions, or if the commission as a group wants to comment on this. We've said a lot in the letter and in the memo, so I don't want to dominate the airspace here, but I just wanted to give you folks a chance to maybe ask us questions and maybe discuss it a little bit.
Questions for the director?
Bill Amaru.
Bill, you recognize.
Bill, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I thought I pressed the right button. So Dan, I've heard both you and Bob mention that we've already reached the 90% reduction goal, which was mandated. And it's proved that we have a fishery that's extremely conservative when it comes to whale protection. Why are we even pursuing additional methods? Why are we talking about ropeless fishing when we've already met our goal? I don't understand this. I think it's not necessarily a waste of time and money, but if we're already where we are, why are we pretending that we have to do more? We're not pretending. Why are we acting as if we have to do more? It's going to be research that's going to be used by other fisheries that should be doing their own research and applying their own funds towards it.
Yeah, let me take a first crack at that, and Bob can weigh in. So what Bob described as a 90% reduction in risk is true, but he's focusing exclusively on the state waters fishery, which by virtue of all the litigation that we've been subjected to and the mandate from the courts for Massachusetts to get an incidental take permit for its state waters fishery, it's okay that we talk about issues of state waters. But we also have many fishermen in our fleet that fish in a combination of state and federal waters. And also we have some fishermen out of our ports that fish in so-called Area 3, which is the offshore fleet that fish the bigger boats, the big cruise, the multiple day trips. All of those groups are facing challenges of the large whale take reduction plans and the federal government's mandates to further reduce risk. And so the 90% hasn't necessarily been met by the federal portion of the fleet, but they're still among our our constituents, our stakeholders. And so we're trying to work with them. For example, down in southern New England, the area, it's almost exclusive in federal waters, but they just enacted a big closure from south of Nantucket west to below Nomans. And so we have Massachusetts vessels that fish there, but they're not fishing in state waters. Or in fact, ironically, some of them did move their gear to the open portion of state waters, which is another issue. But anyway, so that's why we are dealing with this still. But that's the part that really plagued me, is that, okay, if Massachusetts state waters doesn't need this, and if some of the folks that are on the inside on this in terms of the developing conservation strategy, you know, among the NGOs and the federal government, if in their mind, maybe this gear isn't as critical close to shore, then why are we entertaining proposals for fishing close to shore, except if for convenience? I mean, Bill, you've done enough gear research to know that it's, you know, you want to save your fuel costs. If you can do your gear trials close to shore, you know, it's always a little safer and more convenient. I'm okay with that. If they want to do some legit gear trials and some kind of a controlled experiment, I would authorize that. I mean, we're a partner with the federal government. You know, we've been an active member of this of the Ropeless Consortium. You know, I'm good with that. But this wasn't that. This was really an opportunity to go fish and demonstrate, maybe in some photo ops, look, this gear really works. And it really works if you have very few people in the ocean, and if you're fishing gear that's been loaned to you at no cost. So Bob, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And Dan is spot on all those. The only thing I would add is kind of falls into the realm of hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And so there's anything that we've learned in the last decade about right whales is that because of climate change, their distribution is continually shifting, and hence the large mortality that occurred up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence when those whales, you know, redistributed into an active pot fishery up there. And so from my perspective, where there's interest in continuing to develop and research applications and refinements in ropeless fishing, because it's at some point, or hopefully not, but there's potential that if NOAA Fisheries comes back to the state of Massachusetts and says, well, now we need a 97% reduction, or we see a large change in the distribution of right whales, and now we have aggregations that show up in July, August, and September. That puts us in a really different boat as far as the impact of the closure on our fishing industry. Our current closure occurs at a time of year when historically we've only landed 1.5% of the catch and 1.6% of the revenue. And so it's not particularly impactful. And in fact, since the closure, we've seen our catches increase and prices increase. And so we haven't had any real bottom line impact on revenues in the lobster fishery. However, that if we had to then for some reason close, you know, the summer fishery, that would be very impactful, and then it may make sense to have to pursue ropeless technology. And I think it's prudent on our part to allow that development. So if that does happen, you know, we can be in a situation where our fishers could take advantage of that tough situation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I can't disagree with anything either one of you have said. Dan, as usual, you're able to cover all your points very well. I just I want everyone to know that despite all the research and the continuous talk about what's happening with right whales, the commercial fishery in Massachusetts has done more to protect these whales than any other fishery. And just don't feel sometimes like we get anywhere near the credit. And the other thing I must say is when it comes to the lack of these issues to cover what will happen when mobile gear interfaces with lobster gear with no way of identifying it, and especially this example of the, what do they call themselves, this first pioneer group to set gear where they know there won't be any activity from mobile gear, completely obfuscates the answer that we want to come up with, the answers that we're looking for. I was very happy to see that you denied it. And I hope the next time they make an application, they'll make it sensible and one that will actually test the gear in the greatest risk, and that's to the mobile gear fishing industry that operates currently in perfect harmony, very nearly, with the current systems that they use. Well, anyway, those are my comments. This medication I'm on makes me talk for some reason.
Yeah, Bill, thanks for that. And if you get a chance to complete your read as in your recovery of this Noah Oppenheim report, you'll
Yeah.
see one of the issues that he brought up was some of the legal challenges of what's being pondered. For example, how do you regulate the mobile gear fishery to avoid the gear, right? Or if the vision that some of the gear technologists depict is the same information that the lobstermen are able to share with where their gear is through some kind of software, how do you force the dragoman to subscribe to the same data source, and under what authority? So, the gear, I'm sorry, the rules that are being pondered are probably going to be enacted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, I guess, maybe the Sustainable Fisheries Act, but the council has to grapple with this question of, if you're going to be putting unmarked gear on the ocean floor, how are the fisheries that are not having any effect on marine mammals, where's the authority for that? I mean, I'm not saying this is an impossible hurdle, but this is not being addressed yet by the folks at the higher levels of government. Like, where does the authority come from to force a dragger under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to know where the lobster gear is? You can only imagine the difficulty that would bring about. And then there's a section on culpability. Who's culpable if a drag or a scalloper inadvertently goes through unmarked gear? Whose responsibility is it? And those issues really are completely unaddressed. And that's the other thing that just struck me is I just didn't think it was appropriate to move forward with some of the fishing in state waters when, because I told the gang a year ago, I said, well, if you're going to be doing this, I probably need to close these areas while you experiment with this gear. I need to close these areas to mobile gear. I don't see how anybody could do otherwise. And, that was never resolved. So this is a challenge.
Any other comments?
Lou Williams?
Lou, you're recognized.
Yeah, thanks. I kind of, to just pile on to Bill a little bit. I just kind of look, Dan, I was really glad you didn't, I was hoping you wouldn't allow this, because I think we went to the extreme by putting a closure in, and we should benefit that. But I think fishing gear in 20 fathoms of water in Mass Bay, I think if they should go where the boats are fishing, and there's boats fishing down to 80 fathoms right now outside. So I don't know what they're going to gain out of that. And some of the areas they want to put this gear, I'm scalloping right now. So, these are the issues, and I think you addressed them, Dan. So, but I think that any ropeless study should be done out in federal waters where fishing is actively going on, and not in a shoal water fishbowl in Mass Bay. Thanks.
Thank you, Lou. Any other comments?
Not seeing any other comments on this. Oh, Suki Sawyer.
Suki, you're recognized.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Yeah, I'd just like to thank Dan and Bob for dealing with the reality of this whole situation. It seems like there's a lot of fluff out there about, this is going to be the ultimate thing to save the right whale, and the industry's going to love it. And, complete foolishness like that. I think, it's been I know it's how difficult it's been for the division to deal with the pushback on this, but the reality is the industry doesn't see this working, and the only way it can be found out is if it's fished in a real situation amongst everybody else. That's the only answer that's going to work in any of this. And the dragger issue and the scallop issue has really been touched. I mean, Terry Alexander's brought it up at the take reduction team meetings because he's on the management council. But other than that, the dragger part and the scallop part of this has been zero dealt with as far as I'm concerned. And that's probably one of the bigger issues of it all, is who's gonna be responsible and who's supposed to pay attention to where this stuff is, and it's just gets danced around. It's not even dealt with in any kind of reality. So again, thank you guys for what you've done so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Suki. Any other comments?
Not saying any, Mr. Chair.
And we can move along to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission.
Actually, Ray, Bob, did you have any other protected species issues you wanted to touch on after this first one?
Yeah, Dan, just two very quick slides, if I may, Mr. Chair, just to keep the commission aware of what's coming up.
By all means.
Thank you. So just quickly, coming up in the week of May 9th through the 13th, there's a meeting of the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team. This is the first in-person meeting we've had in several years because of COVID. It's kind of a big meeting. National Marine Fisheries Service is tasking the take reduction team with coming up with regulations or management measures to reduce the risk in the mid-Atlantic lobster fishery, the East Coast multi-species trap pot fishery, which would include whelk, fish pot, blue crabs, as well as all East Coast gillnet fisheries by 90%. And so we're anticipating that this is going to be an extraordinarily challenging meeting, very contentious. I think, out of this, one of the most difficult aspects is going to be working with figuring out how to achieve this with the gillnet fishery. We have, less opportunities for gear technology like weak rope and things like that to be effective for those. And so I anticipate the primary coin of the realm will be looking at time area closures. This could be particularly impactful, I suspect, to the monkfish gillnet fishery south of the Cape and what's currently a closed area to lobstering out there. And so I'm just, giving you a heads up that, NIMS is initiating this process. They will take our recommendations by the TRT, evaluate them with an eye towards initiating rulemaking this fall for what they're calling phase 2 of their conservation framework. And so I'll keep you posted in the coming months, but this is likely going to be a fairly difficult issue especially for a lot of our gillnet fishers in federal waters.
Oh, question, Bob?
Yes.
Who will be attending that meeting from DMF? You and Aaron Burke, or?
I'm me. Aaron will be probably attending remotely. They only fly down one member, but I will be the DMF representative there. Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. And then just finally, I wanted to give you a brief update on our incidental take permit. We're making great strides. Aaron Burke and Taylor Stoney and myself have dedicated a lot of time over the last several months and are really starting to put a lot of ground behind us on this application. We're probably almost to the 3/4 mark in its completion. We're planning to submit this in July of 2022. We're at the point right now we're starting to develop what we call management triggers. So asking developing how many takes we're going to ask the federal government for both large whales and sea turtles, and then justifying that, and also developing triggers as to if we exceed those triggers, what we're willing to do. So we're kind of in the middle of that, making good progress, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Questions for Bob?
Not seeing any questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jared. Then we can move along to ASMSC, and I presume Nicola is going to present.
That's right, Ray.
Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the ASMFC updates, we previously covered the commission's January meeting on one of your prior meetings. So this will address a couple ongoing issues from that and look towards the May meeting of the ASMFC.
That's it?
No, I'm just waiting for the slides to come up. Here we go. So first off, I just wanted to confirm with the commission that the measures you endorsed at your last meeting for recreational summer flounder and black sea bass had been approved by the ASMC at a meeting that occurred on March 24th. We very quickly the next day put out an advisory of those measures to inform people, particularly for higher businesses that are interested in the start dates of these seasons. And we are working through the emergency rulemaking process to get those in place as soon as possible. And hopefully we'll be able to put them on our webpage as well soon for people that are looking them up there. There was also a meeting of the Lobster and Jonah Crab Management Board on March 31st to take final action on Lobster Addendum 29, which is the new requirement for electronic vessel tracking in the federal lobster and Jonah crab fisheries. Dan mentioned this earlier about how there is funding expected to be available to help the states administer this new requirement. There had been a lot of lingering questions about the administration of the program at the last time that the board discussed this. And so that there was postponement there to address those. And what will occur now is that the ASMC will work on developing an implementation plan over the next year that includes the standard operating procedures. Also look into a quote for the vessel tracking companies that will be required. The Lobster Board asked that NIMPS publish the final rule for the implementation of this about a year from now at May 1, 2023, and then with an implementation date in December of next year. Dan's motion on this action, which was unanimously approved after a lengthy discussion, also included a plan to review the program, 2 years in to evaluate the data that's being collected through it and the utility and the uses of it. Dan, do you want to add anything else about that board discussion?
Yeah, I mean, for the commission's edification, I would just say that we didn't have the votes a month ago in a previous board meeting. So the board, wisely postponed final action, and the complaints, as you mentioned, or the concerns you mentioned, Nicola, were in regards to some unanswered questions, like what happens if my device fails, can I still fish? And the answer is yes. Just let your state director know, and they'll, we'll give you a permission for temporary until the thing is fixed. I mean, it's not meant to be used as an enforcement tool, where it's really meant to be used as a data gathering tool so that we can properly understand the footprint of the fishery. And then, of course, the issue of cost came up, and the states of New Hampshire and Maine successfully lobbied Congress to help pay for it, but by that $16 million appropriation, which was really exciting. And then the last objection had to do with privacy issues. And we had one particular commission member, from the Maine delegation, that uses his boat to go to Walmart because he lives on an island. And, there was some concerns that, Big Brother is going to be watching, and they wanted the ability to flip a switch and shut the thing off when they wanted. But, that's a whole different, challenge to have a device that either could be turned on and off, or for that matter, would be triggered on when you got out into the federal zone. So this only affects federal permit holders, but it would be always operating. And, as part of my motion and my impassioned plea for this to pass, I described the challenges that I have and the industry has when issues of ocean zoning come up. So, there's a big aquaculture project being proposed just south of the Isle of Shoals. There was the monument that was enacted by President Obama in Southern Georges Bank. There was almost a monument that was enacted on Cash's Ledge, which means fishing would be prohibited. Then you've got the whale plan, you've got wind development, you got compensation for wind. There's so many reasons why an unrepresented lobster fishery or a lobster fishery that doesn't have its footprint well established or well documented is going to be at risk. And I think, we like Nicholas said, it was unanimous, but that doesn't mean every board member voted for it, but we did get every delegation. So I think it's just a great step forward, and it's going to allow the managers to better represent the lobstermen's interests, even if there is some privacy issues. But just like the safest catch report data, this information is going to be controlled by the folks who collect our confidential statistics data. And I have every confidence in them that this information is not going to get out, is not going to be inappropriately used. And instead, it's going to match up really nicely with the new federal requirements for lobster reporting. There's going to be next year an electronic vessel trip report required of all federal permit holders. And this data giving you fishing locations will be just tremendously advantageous for all those reasons.
Okay, thank you, Dan. We'll move on to just a reminder for the commission of a couple of ASMC public comment periods that are still open. As I'm sure you're aware, striped bass draft amendment 7 is in the open public comment period right now. This is addressing the management triggers, recreational release mortality, the rebuilding plan, and conservation equivalency, and the restrictions on its use. So we already had our Massachusetts hearing on March 21st with pretty good attendance. Not a ton of comment. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of options in the document. A lot of them are some more on the kind of administrative side of the plan. It's not just what do you want the bag limit to be. So there are some issues that require, a bit of thought and how they all fit together and, may be better addressed in written comments. So there are a lot of different organizations that are helping provide that public comment. So I do think there'll be a lot of written comment that's being submitted. But if you haven't been a part of that yet and want to be, the comment period is still open until April 15th. And if you missed our hearing, ASMOC and the other councils as well lately are in the habit of making a recording of the presentation that they give at the public hearings and post that on their webpage. And it's been, or on their YouTube page. And so it's really a great resource if you're unable to make the hearing itself, that you can get that same presentation to help understand the options in the document. So the board will be is expected to take final action on those options on May 4th. Another addendum that's out for public comment right now that Mike Piernock mentioned earlier is the recreational harvest control rule addendum. This is a joint action with the Mid-Atlantic Council, and it addresses the recreational measure setting process for fluke, scup, sea bass, and bluefish, and attempts to take into account more the recreational data uncertainty that's inherent in MREP estimates, and consider additional stock information when we go about the annual, or potentially moving forward, every 2-year process of setting measures. And some of the goals of that are to provide more stability to the fishery, more predictability in the measures. So next week we'll have our hearing on April 13th at 6 p.m. and the written comment for that is not due until April 22nd. Again, there's a presentation that's been recorded by ASMFC if you're unable to make our hearing in particular. And final action on this will take place jointly with the Mid-Atlantic Council at their meeting in June, early June, which is slated to be in New York, I believe.
Question, Nicholas?
Sure, go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, so we'll be traveling to New York in June for this joint meeting.
Yes. Shall we drive?
Yes.
Yeah, so there is a brief discussion of this item at the May ASMC meeting at the policy board. And I think it's just to get kind of a first look at the public comment that is coming in, and you know, to help the final action that's is expected to occur in June. So regarding that spring ASMC meeting, this will be ASMC's first meeting in 2 years, getting back together in person at their typical location in Arlington. It will be hybrid though, so public and some commission members may be attending remotely, but the preliminary agenda for this has been posted. Striped bass will be the big issue, but a couple others that I would note are that the ongoing development of that Menhaden addendum that addresses allocation that was previously brought up. I expect that there may be some delay in that because Virginia has raised concerns about the inclusion of 2020 landings data in any new allocation scheme due to the impacts of COVID on the reduction fishery. So there may be a slight delay in the schedule of this addendum, but potentially still getting it in place for next year. Under some options that would include, you know, 2021 data to replace the 2020 data if that particular year has, you know, raises concerns for the state, understandably, given impacts that occurred. There's also going to be some discussion about the TTOG tagging program because some states have raised concerns, or stakeholders have raised concerns about tagging and its impact on the fish and what that is doing to the live market in terms of damage to the fish. So there was an idea at the last meeting to ask some dealers for some input about this, and, you know, market pricing issues from tagging, if those are real, and then continue the discussion from there. We haven't, you know, heard those concerns, I believe, here from dealers in Massachusetts. Additionally, at the policy board meeting on Thursday, I just wanted to note that there's going to be this update on the East Coast climate change scenario planning, which has been a long process to look at how climate change may be affecting East Coast fisheries in the next 20 years and how we are going to adapt and respond our management to that. And so this is really the fourth phase of that. And there's a 2.5-day workshop that's going to take place in Washington, D.C. From June 21st to June 23rd. And if you're interested to attend this, only 75 people are going to be able to attend the workshop, and they're using an application process to you know, get interested participants and select those who will be able to attend. So if you are interested to be a part of that process, the application deadline is April 18th, and you can find more information about that on the Mid-Atlantic Council's page. And then I also, you know, wanted to raise that there'll be some discussion about a mode split working group that had a meeting in March of 2020 for the first time, and then COVID happened, and progress on that was delayed. But that work group came about, you know, after the bluefish decision to have separate bag limits for hire mode and the rest of the recreational fleet, and, you know, some desire for more discussion about what the future of mode splits is, and what type of implications and challenges and accountability may need to go along with that. There's also an amendment that's been initiated by the Mid-Atlantic Council and ASMC, though it's been a lower priority, that is supposed to look at you know, mode splits for fluke, scup, and sea bass. And so, you know, focus may switch to that as opposed to this ASMC working group, but that's what that discussion is going to be about. So because striped bass is the big topic of next week, Mike and I just wanted to cover kind of the next steps for, what will come after the board decision in May when Amendment 7 is presumably going to be approved. So I'm going to pass to Mike here for this slide.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce, because striped bass is so visible and people looking over our shoulders and we've been accused of dragging our feet. I wanted you all to be very clear on the timeline coming up because there's some important and interesting things coming up. So hopefully on May 4th, we will approve the amendment. I think it will go. I don't think there's tons of contentious stuff in there, to be honest, except maybe conservation equivalency. I think there'll be a good discussion about that. But the important thing, so when we're done with that, the next big thing is the assessment, which is starting to be put together right now. So data through 2021. And they'll work on that all summer. And it should be done late September, early October. Definitely the plan is to have it by the next board meeting in October. So the projections for stock growth will go under the assumption that we select in Amendment 7. And one of those options we hope to husband through is a low recruitment scenario, being that we have 3 poor years of recruitment, the last 3 years. We'd like to see some projections if recruitment continues to be bad. And so by the next board meeting, we will have a first look at the Chesapeake Bay recruitment, and I'll let you know what it is when it's publicly released, probably late September. Sometimes we get some previews too from staff in Maryland. So that's going to be really important. If we have a 4th year of poor recruitment, we're going to have to do something drastic. So the next board meeting, we will consider accepting the stock assessment for management purposes. And if necessary, and depending on how things come out for fishing mortality and or recruitment, we're going to have to start crafting regulations to decrease fishing mortality, if that's the case. And so there's 2 different ways we could go, and that's by starting, assuming this is all approved in Amendment 7. We can either start an addendum, and then we probably won't implement it till 2024, or we can go through what we're calling a specification process, where the board itself, working with the TC, comes up with options and approves them without public input. And that will get us those measures in place probably a year before going the addendum route. So anyway, I just wanted to show the timeline so you guys, if constituents ask you, we are moving and we have our eye on the prize. So back to you, Nick, if there's anything else.
I'll move on to the last slide and then look for questions on any of these species. So the last issue is not one that's been on the ASMFC agenda yet, but was brought to our attention by the spiny dogfish group that has that shepherded through the MSC certifications for spiny dogfish. And it came to our attention that spiny dogfish, the Northwest US Atlantic population of it, which has been certified under MSC since 2012, that certification is in jeopardy, it would appear. And that certification is very important because most, if not all, of spiny dogfish goes into the European market, where buyers there, many of them require MSC certification for the import of species. And so the MSC is going through one of its periodic reviews of its own standards, which it uses to certify fisheries. And one of those proposed revisions is it relates to how they identify species as endangered, threatened, or protected. And it would use certain international conservation lists like the CITES list to, identify and automatically designate species as endangered, threatened, or protected. And while the assessment team can make modifications from those lists based on certain characteristics about the stock and or the species life history and how it's managed, that exemption under this proposed revision would not be there for shark species. And the problem is that spiny dogfish, not just the certified Northwest US Atlantic population, but the entire Northern Hemisphere population of spiny dogfish appears on the CMS Appendix 2 list. And so as written, this proposed standard would lead to a decertification of spiny dogfish under MSC. So this raised a lot of concern naturally, which was brought to our attention. DMF submitted a letter or a comment during this open comment period to MSC. Other groups have as well. I know the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance have submitted a comment. The Mid-Atlantic Council submitted a comment. The Sustainable Fisheries Association, which is the name of the client group for that MSC certification, have submitted a comment, and we've also requested a meeting with MSC to discuss this and really underscore our concerns with this issue. So hopefully we'll be able to make some traction and lead to a change to their proposed revised fishery standard. Are there any questions?
Questions for Nicola?
Mike Pearnock.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Nicola, for your presentation. You mentioned there's some discussion about split modes. I just have a question concerning that. Is that referring to separate seasons and bag limits for the for-hire and recreational fleet? Is that referring to sector separation with quotas or not? Either all of the above or partial? I'm just curious. Thank you.
I think all of the above was to be the focus. Just how whether and how management within the recreational sector could consider different regulations within the recreational fishery, and does that mean that there are separate allocations? Are they hard limits? Are they targets? What type of accountability is there? All of those issues was kind of meant to be the focus of this work group as more states have begun to look towards mode splits as regulations have gotten tighter on certain species.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'm interested in the discussion and where this may go, but I think I've noted in the past that we first have to get our recreational and for-hire catch under control and what that truly represents, because to implement separation or quotas or so on that would separate out the two based upon the data that's out there today with many different species, the quick look is it would underestimate many of the, for example, black sea bass and how much is caught or landed by the for-hire fleet. I would hope that there would be continued steps for the use of EVTRs, the use of whatever is needed in order to record what we catch, what we release, and then utilize it for fishery management, and then to look back at the history and come up with a number that is more reflective of what's been landed. Otherwise, it's kind of you get what you wish for if you want it, and then you're behind the eight ball that the quote is so small, you don't have much of anything. So I just throw that out there as a concern, and hopefully whomever is at the table can keep that in mind from DMF. Other thing is the hazard control rule. I attended the recreational summit in DC. It was a 2-day summit in which they did a great job explaining it. I look forward to it. I look forward to it as finally a mechanism to try to address the issues with the MREP numbers and trying to make it work. So I appreciate work that you or others at DMF or at Garfo or so on to get to this point, to get had the hazard control rule on the table and try to make a change instead of the same old operation that we complain about. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions or comments for Nicola?
Bill Amaru.
Bill, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nicola, the last bullet says comment letter submitted in meeting with MSC requested. First question is who will be meeting with them?
We're still setting that up, but it was Dan, requested the meeting with MSC with the John Whiteside, who represents the MSC certification group for spiny dogfish, has also been having discussions with MSC. So we'd like to bring him into the conversation, as well as the Cape Cod Fishermen's Alliance, who we know have submitted a letter and are very interested in this issue as well.
Yeah, I hope that some thought will be given to inviting an appropriate commercial fisherman who's actively involved in the fishery as well. I know there are plenty of good people that could speak to the issue. This obviously is huge for my zone where I live and work and fish. The implications of having an increase in the population of dogfish after we've managed them so well, it is happening. It's a good, healthy fishery. I'm completely stonewalled as to why they are this fishery might, or this stock might be included as a endangered or threatened. The proposed revision, I'm sad to see this whole thing. Automatic designation of species as endangered, certain lists. I'd like to know who the hell makes these lists. What makes them qualified to create a list that will have fish on it that are currently not over, in our case, not overfished, abundant, available, managed intelligently, fished very lightly, with virtually no interaction with other fish species in the taking of them. There's something wrong here at a very basic level. And also one other question, you probably can't answer this, but it does say that certain buyers require the MSC certification, or most buyers. That means some don't. Do we have any idea if our buyers for local dogfish from New England would fall into one or the other categories? You know what the list that the buyers are and who they buy from?
Hey, Bill, this is Dan. I believe it's the secondary buyers, those that would be buying the processed product overseas, because the MSC is way more prominent in Europe. Yeah. And so because almost all the dogfish is shipped to Europe, it's those buyers, not the primary buyers in the Massachusetts.
I realize that, but that creates a bottleneck either way. If they're not buying them from the buyers in New Bedford and Gloucester and other ports that are handling them, it stops the flow. There's no other sort, as you said earlier, or maybe someone else said they go to Europe, and we've been unsuccessful even with all the efforts, major efforts in the terms of grants and research and cookbooks to make these fish palatable to the American public. So we really can't go that route. I've said my piece, so I'll retire. Thank you very much.
Bill, I think this is kind of a technical error on the part of MSC. I don't believe that.
Let's hope so.
And so that's what we want to talk to them about, because attorney John Whiteside brought it to our attention and we had no idea. And so we jumped right on it. So, we hope to just have a friendly conversation with them and let them know that, we're disappointed that this was creating such a urgent response from everybody, given the potential implications. It was, that sort of speaks to the power of MSC, that somebody could make such a technical error and have a huge impact on the economic success of a fishery.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Nicola. Great presentation. Are there any other questions or comments for Nicola?
Not seeing any further not seeing any further hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we're gonna move along. Updates concerning federal fisheries management. I presume Melanie's gonna present.
That's right. And Melanie, you're going to include a short discussion about the macro process and where that fisheries management issue is. Yep, good.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dan, yes, I will include that update. And the council, the New England Council, has not met since your last meeting. So my updates will really be constrained to previewing the April council meeting that begins next week. The big news is that will be the first meeting to return to in-person participation, although it's more truthfully a hybrid meeting, as both council members and the public will continue to be able to participate remotely. So if you're interested, the webinar details are on the council website, and I can certainly distribute them to you directly through Jared. So the Mid-Atlantic Council is concluding its 3-day meeting today, and yesterday they did discuss Atlantic mackerel, and I'll update you on those decisions as well. So in terms of next week's New England Council agenda, I'll focus on the items scheduled for some sort of council action, and this includes initiating Monkfish Framework 13 to adopt 2023 to 2025 specifications. Potential management measures to be considered in the framework include limited access permits, size limits, and measures to address bycatch. We'll also be initiating Groundfish Framework 65, that also is to adopt 2023 to 2024 specifications. It will look at revising rebuilding plans for Gulf of Maine cod and Southern New England Mid-Atlantic winter flounder, any additional measures to promote stock rebuilding in general, and potential revisions to the acceptable biological catch or ABC control rule. Certainly rebuilding Southern New England Mid-Atlantic winter flounder may be of particular interest to commission members, since the focus may be on spawning protections and recruitment, which of course pulls in state waters. Have been talking briefly with the director about ensuring transparency and coordination among the states, New England Council, and ASMSC. So there's no details as of yet, and I'll certainly keep everyone posted as that continues. The one final action scheduled concerns a potential new Southern New England habitat area of particular concern, and that is that map to the right, at least the black, is the boundary of potential, that's the kind of EFH boundary, so where HAPC designation could take place. It is, HAPCs are a subset of EFH, and as such, they're a non-regulatory action. There are no restrictions or rules attached, but basically it would strengthen the National Marine Fisheries Service's EFH consultation process. And this is really the main way that NIMS interacts with BOEM on things like offshore wind development. There has been some updated research that expands the spawning cod season understanding in the area. Right now, the current spawning season is recognized as November to March. Recent research, including work done by Dr. Deaton, and it was involving acoustic work, is expanding that out to April. The council will consider approval of the SCOLP limited access scoping document. This will allow for public comments to help the council assess the need for a leasing program and what elements that program should consider. The scoping document, as drafted to date, includes a pretty robust background on the limited access fishery, its development, the current geographic distribution, performance, crew information, ownership, vessel information, and a series of questions are targeted to solicit feedback on what a leasing program would affect and aspects of the leasing program that should be considered. So in-person and webinar hearings have been scheduled for May through June, and the public comment period will close July 5th. I'll pass that information along after the commission meeting for those interested. Finally, the council will need to consider the Groundfish Committee's recommendation to alter the existing 2022 management priorities. The new priority would craft a plan for transitioning from the current 2 cod management unit from anywhere from 2 to 5 revised management units. Recall, this was really prompted by a question asked of the council if it supported the Atlantic Cod Research Track Working Group's initial proposal for 4 biological units, this as the new paradigm. That working group is chaired by Dr. Lisa Kerr and has been meeting since November 2021 to help develop improved stock assessment for Atlantic cod that can be used for future management track assessment. So included in this possible transition plan is a white paper on potential approaches to allocate Georges Bank cod to the recreational fishery. This recreational allocation white paper would be delivered in 2022 to inform the 2023 priorities discussion. Some work may be completed using contractors. And just in terms of whether this would pass the council's policy on revising priorities is that it does require a 2/3 vote of the council. So next slide. So the remainder of the council meeting is given over to various updates and discussions. Topics include NOAA Fisheries BOEM survey mitigation plan, the scallop evaluation of rotational management next steps. This may include something like a management strategy evaluation. There'll be discussion of sea turtle, bycatch, and trawl fisheries that was happening this week at the MID as well. The Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel has been meeting, so we'll get some updates from them. The GMRI group that is working on maximized retention model of electronic monitoring will provide some updates on their EFP and how that's working. And the goal is that that's actually going to move out from under an EFP to be embedded in the federal regulations. We'll get an update on the annual update on the state of the ecosystem. There'll be some more information about the EAB-FM public information workshops. And we'll have a discussion about the Atlantic herring industry funded monitoring program. There's been a request from industry, but we'll have a discussion about any potential changes with that program. So I'm happy to discuss any of those in more detail offline, but in the interest of the commission's time, I'm not going to elaborate any further on those. Next slide. So finally, in terms of the Mid-Atlantic Council's recent decisions regarding Atlantic mackerel, yesterday they approved the amendment's public hearing document. This includes a suite of rebuilding alternatives based on their current PSAR approach and 2 alternatives that are based on a 10-year rebuilding timeline. Additionally, public comment is going to be sought on specific management measures to align commercial and recreational catch to the pending limits. Commercial measures under consideration include a 3-inch minimum mesh size requirement, possible changes to the river herring shad catch cap given the lower mackerel quota, and there's some consideration that might be given to tightening permitting requirements. And of course, most of you are aware of the discussion we've been having on recreational regulations. The Mid-Atlantic Council will take comment on a 10 or 15 fish bag limit option. Use of a seasonal closure has been moved to considered but rejected, so that won't be included in the document. In terms of the public hearings, those are scheduled. I think we actually tried to help get that word out, so there should be a DMF advisory as well in your inbox on this. One will be in New Bedford on April 25th, another in Plymouth the next day on the 26th, and then there will be a webinar option on May 2nd. And the Mid-Atlantic Council is still planning to take final action in June with implementation plan for January 2023. Measures for further years out would be considered after the 2023 management track assessment. So this is just for the 2023 management year. And then, of course, the New England states, Maine, New Hampshire, and Mass are coordinating potential recreational measures for implementation in January 2023. State public hearings aren't scheduled yet, but we're likely to hold those sometime this summer. And Mr. Chair, that's it for my update. So if there are any follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Very concise report, presentation. Questions for Melanie?
Bill Amaru.
Bill, I was waiting for you to chime in. You're recognized.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Melanie. Really good report. My question is a little bit fuzzy in my head right now, but I want to be sure I understand this. from what I heard you just say at the close of your description of the mackerel actions, there should not be any changes for this summer's fishery. This is all going to come into effect, whatever they choose after in 2023.
Yeah, so recall that in terms of the commercial fishery, the MID through NIMS had already requested several emergency actions that have taken place. And in turn, this actual action wouldn't be implemented until January of 2023. So
Right.
anything that is the consequence of this action, that's the timeline.
Right. So, but NIMS could still, of course, as they always have the ability to do an emergency action at some
Sure.
point during the season.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't heard the MID request anything though, further than what's already been enacted.
Yeah. Okay. And then a previous slide on groundfish, I was interested in the trawl. I saw a statement sent out by email from NIMS saying that they were putting together a new research group that would include commercial fishermen. Have they had very much luck? Have they worked forward on that and gathering a group of commercial fishermen that would participate in the survey?
I'm not sure I'm clear what which are you referring
Okay,
to?
about a month ago, I received in my inbox from the National Marine Fisheries Service a statement saying that they were going to revise the annual stock survey methodology. And it was to include this time a robust representation of members from the commercial industry who would work with science and management on the stock assessment. That's
Yeah,
what I'm specifically
okay.
dealing with.
I for some reason I thought you were referring to the actual conduct of the survey, but you're talking about the management stock assessment process.
Right.
And I can follow up with you in terms of what actions NIMS has taken, but yeah, I know. I mean, they comprise a working group. I'm not aware. I mean, Micah. So we have representation on that working group. I'm not aware of any commercial fishermen serving on that working group, but in terms of public input during that process, I can double check with Dr. Hare and others in terms of how they plan to allow for that and get back to you.
Thank you very much.
Questions for Melanie?
Mike Piernock.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Melanie, for your presentation. Concerning mackerel, the Mid-Atlantic's recommendation for a 10 to 15 fish per person recreational bag limit, is that for state as well as federal waters?
The analysis, as I understand it, takes into account that there would be consistent regulation, right? So in terms of what kind of reduction would be achieved, because obviously the lion's share of the recreational catch is happening in state waters. But it would, whatever action they take, it's not, the state has to take action to decide what its recreational rules are going to be. So it's whether they adopt a 10 or 15, we would need to act our own state regulations to adopt that. But in terms of that analysis and what they're showing as the reductions, yes, that takes into consideration consistent measures.
And DMF, as well as New Hampshire and Maine, have collectively commented on these measures the past few months now. Is there intent of doing the same in the future, and has a position been developed yet by the three states concerning this proposed bag limit?
We've certainly been working to coordinate with them. We've had a lot of high-level discussions with the directors of the various states, and I mean, you've seen, as you mentioned, you've seen the outcome of those with those letters. So I'm certain the intent is to try to adopt consistent measures. I don't want to speak out of turn for them. We all have to conduct our own state rulemaking processes, but yeah, certainly the intent is try to coordinate on that.
Thank you. Just on the surface, 15, I wish it was 15 to 20 seems reasonable. Most, I believe, would be happy with such for use for striped bass fishing as well as for bluefin fishing. There's two players, though, that per se that may have issue with it. If you take the for-hire fleet, what many of our for-hire fleet will do in state waters is that they will go early in the morning, catch a load of those fish and use them in the day and put them in a fish pen at night to then use them during the week. So I don't know if there's any thoughts for how to address that, whether it's a separate bag limit for the for hire versus the rec, or something to be taken into consideration of what the possession limit may be. In addition, not that I'm surprised, but the outreach by the community is such that there are for hire vessels that take a certain segment of the population out fishing for mackerel, and they eat the mackerel. And to no surprise, such clientele fill up the garbage cans full in order to eat the fish. It doesn't look as though there's anything there to accommodate them, but I just want to point out that there are some that do that, and there are some that do that from the shore or from a boat. And this reduction to 10 to 15 will likely result in those individuals not retaining a for hire or going on typically a party boat to do such. That part of the community is hardworking individuals that many of which are not English speaking and trying to make it by and trying to get the fish to put food on the plate. So I just throw that out there because there's been comments that have come my way concerning from recreational use, commercial use to for hire, as well as those in the community that are the haves and the have-nots trying to make it by. So is there any flexibility there at both ends for the for hire or with these other individuals that I'm mentioning that are putting food on the plate? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I know you and I have talked briefly about some of these unique operational details. For instance, that filling the bait well before you're actually having the customers on board. And first of all, those are the kind of details I hope you and others will bring forward during the public hearings. It'll be important for the Mid-Atlantic staff and members to hear that kind of detail in terms of what can be crafted. Talking through with you just a little bit, I would think we've had vessel limits on for hire vessels before that kind of take into consideration, well, okay, here's the per person bag times the people on board. So maybe there could be some kind of consideration like that. How it gets enforced, that's a whole nother detail. Is it okay, you have to be able to show how many paying customers you're going to have on ahead of time, and then you can multiply it by that. I don't know, but those are great details that I hope will come forward during the public hearing process, so we can get this as right as we can.
Thank you, Melanie.
Melanie, it's Ray Kane. I have a question for you. I thought I heard you briefly touch on changes in permitting, and my concern is on a commercial level. We do have a huge fleet of small vessels that commercially fish on mackerel. Have you heard anything in negotiations at the Mid about that? Are they going to try to take that away from the small boats?
It was not about taking away. This was more about making sure that the monitoring and the catch reporting is tight and really reflecting some of the loopholes that inadvertently exist, especially when it comes to a fish used as bait. A lot of the discussion was really having to do with the HMS permit and also the for hire permitting. So it's not about implementing some new limited access or taking away. It's really just about ensuring we're getting the best data through the permitting process.
Okay, so then I can assume, once again, you're talking more about recreational and for hire, because commercial landings now are reported. I mean, they have hard data on these.
Yeah, it was more aimed at the for hire side, and there was some pushback by some members concerned about what this would mean for other things like butterfish and a few other species that are used in a similar bait capacity, but don't have those requirements.
Thank you. And one more question. Why the lack of fishing pressure this year? I know last year they shut themselves down by February, if I'm not mistaken. And when I look at landings, they're really not mackerel fishing. Have you got insight to that? What's going on there?
Well, one of the biggest influences has been, the Amendment 8 buffer zone, which is now under scrutiny and under question in the lawsuit.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions for Melanie?
Mike Pearnock?
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Kane, for throwing the permitting issues out there. I do want to just throw out there, Melanie, that I think it'd be prudent for at whatever forum, whether at the state or the federal level or both, to have a description of the different permits that are required if you're recreational, for hire, or commercial for mackerel, and its use for bait, for striped bass, as well as bluefin tuna. Once again, I'll get back to the recreational summit. I had at the table the HMS people, the Garfo people, as well as myself, as well as DMF. And there was confusion around the table of the permitting requirements by some. There is a mechanism, though, for if you are a federally permitted vessel, such as my vessel. I not only have a Northeast multi-species permit, but I have a Mid-Atlantic permit, for hire permit to catch mackerel, as well as squid and bluefish and so on. So it pulls you in that way. If you are a HMS permitted vessel and not, whether it's general category HMS permitted vessel, then you would need a Mid-Atlantic commercial mackerel permit to catch it for bait. I think there's some out there that may not be aware of that. And then when you get into the state and you're only in state waters, it may not necessarily be the same. So these inconsistencies are confusion for many, and hopefully there can be clarification that can be put out there to make it clear to the public what we need for, as you say, so it can be adequately reflected what's being caught as well as released. Thank you.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Mike. I think that kind of permit and reporting compliance guide that is very specific to Atlantic mackerel would go a long way. So I'll continue to push that with the council and agency staff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie.
I'm not seeing any further comments, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we can move on to other business. Commission member comments, and I'll read through the roster. We'll start with Suki. Any comments, Suki?
I'm all set, Ray. Thanks.
Thank you, Suki. Bill Doyle.
I'm set, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Lou Williams.
Yeah, Ray, it's something maybe Deanna, Jared could, I'm looking for just a rationale for a closure. Like I said earlier, we're doing some scalloping in state waters, and yesterday I was on the boat and I was thinking, maybe I'll go up to the east and off Rockport. And then I pulled up my paperwork and I realized there's in that exempted area up there, it's closed April 1st to June 14th. I think when this was put in, it was put in for gear conflicts, obviously. And now with closures and groundfish closures, I just wondering what the rationale is for that closure now.
Lou, I'd have to look into the history of that, but I will do that and get back to you.
Okay. Like I said,
off the top of my head.
Yeah, and like I said, if there's no rationale for it nowadays, maybe it shouldn't be there. That's all. That's my thing. But I'll give you a call, Jared.
Yeah, sure. I'll look
Okay,
into
thanks.
stuff here to get back to you, Lou.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Lou, well, I'll work on that with Jared too. So we'll get back to you later today.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Lou. Shelley Edmondson.
Thanks,
Comment?
Ray. I have no comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. Bill Amaru, comments.
Bill, you're muted.
We'll come back to Bill. Mike Peardnock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope Bill Amaru and Khalil feel better, get back on their feet. I know Tim Brady is on the line. He's been on for a while, so I don't know whether he has any comments. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna make the same note, Mike. I've been trying to promote him, but I haven't been able to, but we can see if he has a comment, Mr. Chair, we can see if we can't get him unmuted.
So is he unmuted now, Jared?
I've given him authority. He is, yes.
Tim Brady, any comments, closing comments?
No, thank you. I think I have some technical issues with Wi-Fi on this end, so I appreciate Jared continuously trying to get me back in as a panelist, but no comments here. But I appreciate all the work everybody's doing, and the mackerel is a big deal. Mackerel's our primary live bait for striped bass and tuna, and you know, as the types of fish dwindle down to what we can target with the hopes of sending, you know, a client home with a fish, mackerel is really important to that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tim. Bill Amaru, you on?
He left the meeting, Ray, according to the chat.
He left the meeting. Thank you, Suki. Khalil.
I'm all set, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil. And I just want to thank commission members for attending, and I'm going to open it up to public comment. Have you got anybody in the public, Jared?
If you're a member of the public and wish to comment, please use the raise hand function and we'll recognize you. Bill Coates.
Bill Coates, you're recognized.
Bill, you're muted.
Is he still muted, Jared?
Bill, you're still muted.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, I sent
Here I
a
am.
message.
You got me?
Oh, you're talking to
Yes.
someone else.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Phil.
I'm getting used to a new computer and I keep banging the touch screen, which doesn't exist. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, staff. Good meeting as always. Just at one point or a couple of points regarding striped bass. I have a little bit of a disagreement with Dan with regard to his comment that there's no need to take action on bass permits at this time, but we can talk about that later. I'm still concerned about the fact that we need to move forward on this. We have, and particularly in light of what's going to happen with Amendment 15 and after Amendment 7 and after. As Mike indicated, there's concern about habitat in the Chesapeake, anoxia. We've seen a tiny example of what happens with anoxia in Cape Cod Bay, where the finfish can swim away when there's a problem. But the Chesapeake Bay, the young of the year fish are, you know, they're tiny, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 or 4 inches long. They may not be able to get out of those anoxic areas. And these 3 years of poor year classes, the last 3 years, may be partly caused by that problem. And I just want to call your attention to the fact that the last time we had 3 poor year classes in a row was way back when we started managing bass, because we had 3 bad year, at least 3 bad year classes in a row. And that was due to the fact that there weren't any bass. The population was way down. Right now, the spawning stock biomass is certainly sufficient to generate a good year class. Yet, we've had these 3 years and I'm very concerned about that. I think this is the elephant in the room with regard to striped bass. I did note Story said that there was no problem with people who have commercial permits to take their fish home. There was hardly any example of that when they did a survey. Well, my informal surveys and talking to people at the ramp up to about a year and a half ago, I'd often run into people, rec commercials or whatever you want to call them. It said, oh, I got a couple of bass, I can take them home and eat them. And so, you know, I don't know how this survey was conducted, but it could be a significant issue. And the cynics also talk about why DMF won't cut back on the permits is due to the fact that they make so much money on them, which isn't true because I know the revenue doesn't go to DMF, it goes into the general fund. But, you know, just add it up. And if you take away the guys that hold permits, commercial fishermen that hold permits, you still get about $200,000 or $300,000 in revenue from the rec commercials who basically catch minimally or don't even fish. And they're just clutter. They need to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with probably before you put in Amendment 7. And I know that's going to be impossible because Amendment 7's on a fast track. And I thank Nicola and Mike for reminding everybody that unlike the IRS, the comment deadline for Amendment 7 is next week, next Friday, the 15th. Take care, everyone. Get well, everybody that's recovering and having health problems. I feel for you. Take care.
Thank you very much, Phil. Anybody else from the public, Jared?
Not seeing any further comments or hand raised, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn. Do we have to do a roll call on a motion to adjourn?
We don't, no. Dan, did you have anything else?
Well, yeah, Ray, I've been talking to Jared about the scheduled May meeting, and I know we've got some workload issues, including dealing with the Welk petition, and that's going to take a lot of staff time. And we were wondering if we might not get away with canceling the May meeting in favor of the June and July meetings. And Jared, do you want to follow up?
Sure. So, Mr. Chair, there's two, following today's meeting, there's two items on the horizon. There's the Welk petition that we discussed briefly last month that staff need to review and provide a memo to the commission on. And a lot of that staff is also involved in the ITP permit, Bob and myself included. And the other aspects being the recreational fishing rules. We're going to need a final action of those emergency rules, and that likely won't be occurring until late May or early June, the earliest that we'd be able to get that out to public hearing. So given those considerations, I think May would be a pretty light agenda should we move forward, as those two items, which are the two things on the horizon, likely won't be ready for game time until June anyways.
Okay, my question to you, Jared, are we going to do an in-person meeting in June, or are we going to do the virtual?
I think the hope was to have it in person.
And have you found a location?
I have not yet, no.
Okay.
But we'd be amending that day from June 9 to probably June 7th, as we'd be moving the meetings from Tuesday to Thursday, beginning in June, as you discussed in the last meeting. And if it is an in-person meeting, I'll work on finding a fairly central location.
Very good, because then we'll have a follow-up meeting in July. But I know there are a number of commission members chomping at the bit to actually meet people in person. So let's really push for an in-person meeting come June 7th.
Okay.
All right, anything else to discuss? Then I'm asking for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, Ray, Suki.
Thank you, Suki. I need a second.
Second, and Shelley.
Thank you, Shelley. Is there any opposition?
No opposition, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no opposition, this meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everyone.